Unknowingly, there was now gradually only a month left of the initial 3-month period before the peak selection ceremony. Due to this, the atmosphere covering the entire outer mountains seemed to become tenser. Numerous disciples were desperately training, working hard in hopes that they would be able to raise their strength to better their chances of getting a good placing in the peak selection ceremony, while also hopefully catching the eye of some of the Spirit Devouring Mountain's elders and obtaining good cultivation prospects. After all, numerous high-level personnel would be present on the day of the peak selection ceremony, making it an excellent chance to display one's abilities. As such, the atmosphere in the outer mountains was no longer as relaxed as before during this period, even the air itself seemingly filled with a tense feeling. If they were not training on Energy Mountain, everyone would be in one of the many lecture halls working on their spiritual techniques, all for the sake of growing stronger. Ezra was likewise no exception. The time he had now every day was exceptionally enriched with activities, training on Energy Mountain, giving spiritual technique guidance, and studying the recently acquired 8 lost dragons. Hence, Ezra Zephyr maintained a vigilant state of mind, now allowing himself to relax as he invested all his time and effort into improving himself. After all, Ezra Zephyr was well aware of his goal, to make use of the excellent training conditions here to raise his prowess to the next level of the core formation stage in the shortest possible time. Back in the sovereign side of the Naren continent, the Bloodfang kingdom was eyed like prey by the Brownmane Empire. The ambitious Emperor Bruce had turned his eyes to the Bloodfang kingdom ever since the death of his second son, Victor Brownmane. Once Emperor Bruce found an opportunity, the Bloodfang kingdom would surely face calamity once again. Hence, if Ezra Zephyr does not want the Bloodfang kingdom to be destroyed when he returns, he needs to make use of every second he had to strengthen himself. On the balcony of a certain little house, the prince was seated in a pool of sunshine, his eyes lightly shut as he held the 8 lost dragons' jade strip in his hand. His mind entered the strip as he immersed himself in its marvels. After a long time had passed, Ezra's eyes slowly opened. He had been trying to comprehend this spiritual technique for several days and was gradually beginning to grasp the important points. The prince gazed at the jade strip as he mumbled to himself, "This technique is fantastic." According to what was written in the jade strip, a unique method was needed to practice the 8 lost dragons. It required one to refine 8 different dragon-type martial animal blood and meld them together into a spiritual technique mark, before branding it on the core. Once learned, one would be able to form dragons with one's spiritual energy in battle. At the advanced level, 8 dragons could be sent out that boasted extremely overwhelming power that was almost comparable to a true high-tier gamma layer technique. The most amazing thing about it was that the higher grade of the blood, the more powerful the technique would be. However, the difficulty lies in refining the dragon-type martial animal blood. Such blood will surely be violent and untamable. If fused into the body, the slightest negligence would give it the chance to erode and invade the body. Hence, one would need absolute control over it. Those that could be considered dragon-type martial animals were too strong. The blood of such martial animals was extremely berserk, and ordinary people would not dare to fuse it into one's body. Ezra Zephyr fell into thought for a brief moment, before shaking his head, deciding not to think too much about it. It seems that he had to make a trip to the Glittering Jewels Pavilion. He should be able to find the blood he required there. With these thoughts in mind, he decided to act. He left the balcony and walked down the steps to the first floor. In front of the little house, Gil Subzi also followed. He was tagging along purely because there were many items in the Glittering Jewels Pavilion, and maybe even some good alcohol. The Glittering Jewels Pavilion was located on one of the central peaks. The giant octagonal building seemed to spread outwards like some kind of behemoth, while wind chimes could be seen hanging at all 8 corners. When the wind blew, a clear tinkling sound would spread that was extremely pleasing to the ear. This was likewise one of the most popular places in the outer mountains and was frequented by numerous disciples. After all, there were many treasures inside, and people would occasionally find themselves shopping here for an entire day. After entering, Ezra left Gil to his own devices, while he went to seek out one of the servants' girls. "I need dragon-type martial animal blood, the higher the rank the better," the prince generously declared, as if money was something he did not lack. After all, being an instructor of a spiritual technique had indeed recently made him rather wealthy. The servant girl was initially stunned by his words. Soon after, she sweetly said, "Please follow me, I will find the manager for you." Hence, the servant girl led Ezra into one of the inner rooms, to be seated. The prince waited inside for a while, and a middle-aged man soon entered. He smiled as he sized up Ezra and said, "I am Rumoro, a manager of the Glittering Jewels Pavilion. Young brother Ezra Zephyr has become quite a popular figure in the Outer Mountains recently." Although Rumoro was a manager at the Glittering Jewels Pavilion, he was also an official Outer Mountain disciple. It was due to his age that he had been assigned here. "I heard that young brother Ezra Zephyr wants dragon-type martial animal blood?" Rumoro smiled. "You must be intending to practice the 8 lost dragons, right?" Although there were not many disciples currently who could practice the 8 lost dragons, there were ultimately still a number of them. It was obvious that they had also come to the Glittering Jewels Pavilion in search of dragon-type martial animal blood. The prince, Ezra Zephyr, nodded as he cupped his fists together. "I'll be troubling manager Rumoro." "Not a problem." Rumoro chuckled. With a wave of his hand, a servant girl brought in a silver plate on which sat 3 jade bottles. The bottles were crystal clear, the viscous scarlet liquid within giving off a faint berserk aura. "These are the blood of the frosty croc, 3-headed flame lizard, and the thunder rumble wyvern. All of them are peak tier 2 martial animals, and each bottle will cost 500 spirit jade pieces." "Peak tier 2, huh?" Ezra frowned slightly. "Is there anything better?" Peak tier 2 was only equivalent to the peak level of a core formation stage, a level that did not satisfy Ezra Zephyr at all. After all, the higher quality of the blood, the more powerful the 8 lost dragons would become. Although he did not dare to hope for anything too high a grade, peak tier 2 was still rather low in his opinion. "Looks like young brother Ezra Zephyr does not lack spirit jade." Rumoro laughed upon hearing this. Normally speaking, most of the disciples that practiced the 8 lost dragons would be more than satisfied with such a tier of martial animal blood. It was mainly because the unofficial Outer Mountain disciples were currently not very rich. He waved his hand and another servant girl brought in 2 silver plates, covered by red cloth. He pulled off the first plate as another 3 bottles appeared. Scarlet blood bubbled within these bottles, the berserk undulations able to permeate the special material from which the bottles were made. Just the smell alone made one feel one's body heat up. "These are from the Crimson Crude Dragon, the Century Earth Snake and the Pink Devil Lizard. All of them are initial stage tier 3 martial animals and are exceedingly formidable. Even 7th peak level core formation practitioners would find them impossible to defeat." Rumoro said and chuckled. "However, they are also very expensive. A single bottle will cost 1,500 spirit jade pieces." He looked towards Ezra Zephyr and grinned. "How about it, are you satisfied now?" Amazement was displayed on Ezra's face. The Glittering Jewels Pavilion really had everything. Initial tier 3 martial animal blood was indeed an excellent cultivation resource for him. However, they were indeed expensive. Ordinary unofficial Outer Mountain disciples only received 30 spirit jade pieces a month. They may earn more by working hard on missions, but it would at most reach a sum of a few hundred spirit jade pieces, which was far from enough to purchase these martial animal types of blood. The prince pondered for a bit, before suddenly looking towards the other still covered silver plate as he curiously asked, "What about this?" He could faintly sense even more berserk undulations spreading from it. Rumoro was taken aback. Soon after, he said, "I'm afraid that young brother Ezra Zephyr might not be able to use that martial animal blood." "Why?" asked the prince. Rumoro lifted the red cloth, revealing 3 jade bottles. The scarlet blood within had already formed mini whirlpools in which a faint silhouette seemed to hover. An alarming berserk undulation violently pulsed from them. "These are?" Ezra Zephyr's eyes widened. He could feel a dangerous aura from the martial animal blood in these 3 jade bottles. Rumoro's expression was somewhat solemn as he slowly said, "The martial animal blood of 3 peak tier 3 dragon-type martial animals. Ezra Zephyr's pupils involuntarily shrunk slightly. Peak Tier 3 martial animal blood, wasn't that equivalent to a early-level nascent soul expert? He never imagined that the Glittering Jewels Pavilion would have blood of this. Level 2. Only now did Ezra realize why Rimuro had said he would be unable to use them. Peak Tier 3 blood was too volatile and violent. Ordinary second-level core formation stage disciples would not dare to refine and absorb it. However, Ezra was not an ordinary man at all. So he was willing to take the risk. Most importantly, though other core formation practitioners did not dare, it did not mean that he shouldn't as well. In addition, if he was able to refine Peak Tier 3 blood, the 8 lost dragons would undoubtedly be even more powerful. It was this point that truly enticed Ezra Zephyr. The werewolf prince chuckled in satisfaction, and decisively said, "Manager Rimuro, how much are these 3 bottles? I want them." Rimuro was stunned, evidently not expecting the prince to have such boldness. However, he soon let out a bitter laugh as he awkwardly shook his head. "Young brother Ezra, I'm afraid that I can't sell them to you." "Why?" The prince was likewise taken aback by Rimuro's words. The former soon frowned as he asked, "Is it a problem with the price? Or are you worried that I will not be able to refine them?" "Manager Rimuro need not worry about such matters, I understand my limits." Rimuro waved his hand, and awkwardly said, "It's not that these 3 bottles have already been booked by someone else. I only took them out earlier, just in case. I did not expect that they would actually end up catching your eye." He truly had not expected Ezra Zephyr's standards to be so high that even an early Tier 3 martial animal blood was unable to catch his fancy. As it happens, Ezra just had to end up taking a fancy to these Peak Tier 3 blood. One must know that they were equivalent to the Peak Foundation Establishment stage and early Nascent Soul stage. How could a second-level core formation stage practitioner have the balls to even try blood at this level? Ezra Zephyr's frown deepened. He had not expected these bottles of blood to be booked by someone else. "Are there any others of the same level?" asked Ezra Zephyr. Rimuro shook his head. "These are the only ones we have in the unofficial Outer Mountain branch. We're not the official Outer Mountain after all, they will likely have ample stock." Ezra Zephyr was somewhat speechless. He was really a little unwilling to give up the 3 Peak Tier 3 dragon-type martial animal blood. Hence, he could not help but ask, "May I inquire as to which fellow disciple has booked them? I can buy them from him or her at double the price." The 8 lost dragons had high requirements towards the quality of the martial animal blood used. Ezra Zephyr naturally wanted the process would be as perfect as possible, while also minimizing the risk of any flaws. Rimuro hesitated upon hearing this. Just as he was about to speak, faint laughter was suddenly heard from outside the door, laughter that contained a hint of playfulness. "Hee, it seems that tutoring spiritual techniques really does pay well. I would never have imagined that I, Drake Tubble, would one day be offered such a good deal." The doors were pushed open as Drake Tubble walked in with full white clothes, wearing a faint smile, a mocking look in his eyes as he stared at Ezra Zephyr. The prince's expression involuntarily darkened. He had not expected the one who had booked the 3 bottles of martial animal blood to be this Drake. "Are you also practicing the 8 lost dragons?" Ezra's eyes narrowed slightly. 8 lost dragons? Drake laughed. "Although it's not bad, I naturally have better options. I was merely bought the blood for fun." Iciness flitted across Ezra Zephyr's eyes. It was obvious that Drake knew he was practicing the 8 lost dragons and had intentionally taken actions to obstruct him in secret, pre-booking the highest quality blood in the Glittering Jewels Pavilion. Through this, Drake would be able to lower Ezra's performance in the peak selection ceremony a month later. "Oh? You want to go at it? Who gave you the courage?" Drake playfully laughed, staring mockingly at Ezra Zephyr without a single hint of fear as powerful spiritual energy swept out from his body. "Both of you stop!" Rimuro hurriedly shouted when he saw that the two were about to fight, standing in between them to stop them. "If you fight in the Glittering Jewels Pavilion, there will be consequences." With a wave of his hand, a swarm of figures surged out within the glittering jewels pavilion, energy after energy rising as they targeted the two individuals. Iciness flashed as Ezra and Drake's gazes clashed. In the end, both of them withdrew their spiritual energy with a cold snort. They knew that it would be almost impossible to escape punishment if they were to fight here, which would only end up wasting their precious training time. Drake laughed icily. Soon after, he waved his sleeve, sweeping away the 3-peak Tier 3 martial animal blood on the plate as he uncaringly said, "Don't worry, even if all of the blood rots away in my hands, I will never sell them to you." The anger in Ezra's eyes gradually receded, however, it still raged like a tsunami in the depths of his eyes. He ignored Drake, turning his head instead to look towards Romero. "Manager tomorrow, I'll purchase the early Tier 3 martial animal blood." Since there was no peak Tier 3, Ezra had no choice but to use the early Tier 3 for the time being. Hopefully, it would only result in a slight decrease that would not be too noticeable. Romero apologetically looked at Ezra Zephyr and nodded, before instructing someone to bring over the blood. Ezra received them and paid. Without saying anything else, he turned around and headed for the exit. When he brushed past Drake, the latter suddenly smiled faintly and said, "Do you think this is over, unwashed werewolf? You will soon get to enjoy all the fun I prepared for you." Ezra's eyes narrowed as he tilted his head to look at Drake. "You like to stir up trouble? I've heard that you are determined to win first place in the peak selection ceremony?" The corners of Ezra's lips seemed to be slowly hooked up by something, forming in devilish angle. Drake Tubble also turned his head and grinned. "What do you think you can do?" Ezra stared at him and slowly said, "I'll have to regretfully inform you that you will no longer be able to take first place. If you want to play, I'll accompany you until both of us are satisfied." Ezra withdrew his gaze, turned around and walked off. Drake was stunned as he watched the former leave. Soon after, a mocking smile involuntarily spread from the corners of his lips. He shook his head as if having heard the most ridiculous and laughable thing. Truly such an ignorant and overly proud fool. "Haha, I do want to see how you'll snatch first place from me." After leaving the room, Ezra exhaled deeply, spitting out the unhappiness in his heart. Drake's actions had indeed disgusted the former this time. "Without the peak Tier 3 martial animal blood, I'll just have to make do with early Tier 3. Muttered Ezra Zephyr to himself. He no longer wanted to think any further about this topic, and soon Gil Subzi came as well. As they walked through the mountains, Gil's clear eyes swept a glance at Ezra Zephyr, his chubby lips parting widely as he asked, "Your Majesty. You're clearly in a bad mood, did something anger you again? Is it that clear?" Ezra Zephyr gently touched his face. Hearing that, Gil's eyes remained on Ezra's face. The Prince of Bloodfang Kingdom sighed and began to tell him what had happened earlier. After hearing his story, Gil's pretty face seemed to ripple slightly. "Does your Majesty's 8 lost dragons require dragon-type martial animal blood?" The prince nodded. "But I can only buy early Tier 3 martial animal blood from the Glittering Jewels Pavilion, which is less than ideal. The 8 lost dragons I end up with will be weaker too," said Ezra Zephyr. Gil Subzi got lost in pondering. And in that vicinity of time, Fenrir spoke. "Boy, this is really not much of a problem." Ezra Zephyr flinched inwardly. "Fenrir, why didn't you answer me all this time? Where were you?" "Haha, did you cry, boy? Not even my dick would cry for you, hollow-brained mutt," Ezra retorted. He laughed and looked at Ezra Zephyr as he lowered his voice. "I have a method to make your early Tier 3 blood even better than peak Tier 3 blood." Ezra Zephyr's eyes widened as he asked in bewilderment, "Really?" Fenrir forcefully nodded his chin before he said, "Let me tell you a secret. If you mix my son's blood with the blood of that early Tier 3 dragon-type martial animals, you can raise their quality." Ezra's feet instantly froze in place as he squinted his eyes and looked straight at Fenrir. The monstrous wolf of Norse grinned slightly and said, "You cannot tell them that you heard this from me." Hearing that Ezra moved towards the mountain, he found a cave and went there. Ezra's wolf bracelet shone and 2 cubs came out. One was cerulean and the other had crimson color. They were sons of Fenrir, Skoll and Hati. Ezra took in a deep breath, before displaying his kindest and friendliest smile as he took the dazed Skoll and Hati. Skoll yawned in sleep as if he didn't care. However, Hati was an emotional one and jumped at him. He gently caressed it as he said in a tender voice, "Little cutie, I need your favor?" Hati was exceedingly smart and possessed high intelligence. Hence, it naturally understood Ezra Zephyr's words, causing it to feel a little awkward, using its tiny paws to cover its eyes. "Do you want to enjoy an extremely delicious meal made of martial animals?" Ezra Zephyr enticed. Hati vigorously nodded its little head, its eyes practically glowing. Ezra Zephyr revealed a warm smile as he said, "If you want to eat such meals regularly, I'll have to first have enough spirit jades. That's why I need you to do me a tiny little favor such that I will be able to obtain even more spirit jade in the future and let you regularly have great, sumptuous meals." Hati was taken aback. Soon after, it somewhat warily looked at Ezra Zephyr. It had sensed a faint hint of danger by instinct. Ezra Zephyr gazed at Hati as he retrieved a tiny little jade bottle from his sleeve and said with a faint smile, "It's actually very simple, I just need a tiny bit of blood from you." All the cerulean hairs on Hati's body stood on end. It curled up its body and barked at Ezra Zephyr. This fellow wanted its blood. "If you can't even help me with this small favor, I'm afraid that we'll no longer be able to eat the meals that I told you about," said Ezra Zephyr in a calm voice. However, the threat within his words was extremely clear. It's been ages since these two cubs have eaten anything good. Hesitation flashed across Hati's beady eyes. It was evidently violently struggling inside. "Do you want to eat stuff like the sumptuous meal, such as dried meat? Won't it be regretful if you can't ever taste something like that?" Ezra's words were filled with temptation. In the end, Hati let out a pained wail, before it dejectedly extended a paw, evidently no longer able to resist Ezra Zephyr's enticement. A grin cracked open from the corners of Ezra Zephyr's lips when he saw this. The short sword, Efsa, began to glow, its blue-colored hue flickering with a sharp cold light. Ezra Zephyr channeled his strength, the sword tip transforming into a flash of light as it ruthlessly thrust towards Hati's paw. Sparks flew when the sharp brush tip landed on Hati's icy paw. However, it had only made a tiny dent, unable to pierce even the tiniest little hole. Ezra Zephyr was dumbstruck. This defense was way too strong. Hati cast over a disdainful gaze. "I let you cut, but you can't even cut it open, so useless." He raised the sword again and took in a deep breath. Spiritual energy surged along the sword, converging into a blue aura at its tip. The sword tip whizzed forth once again. It finally worked this time, cutting open a tiny slash on Hati's paw from which fresh blood immediately dripped out. Ezra hurriedly stretched forward the bottle to catch the drops of blood. Only now did he discover that Hati's blood had a deep blue hue. Every drop seemed to be extremely heavy while giving off a mysterious sensation. So heavy. The hand holding the jade bottle sunk slightly. Hati's blood was exceptionally heavy. This truly is the good stuff. Ezra Zephyr licked his lips. His senses told him that Hati's blood was extraordinary. He immediately grabbed Hati's paw and squeezed it tightly to make more blood drip out faster. Hence, after a few minutes, Ezra Zephyr was finally able to fill a bottle. However, he could not help but lick his lips as he swiftly fished out another bottle, eyes seemingly burning as he said, "A little more, a little more." This was such a hard-to-come-by opportunity, he would get every last drop he could. Grrrr. However, Hati released an angry growl in response to his actions. Its paw suddenly raised and mercilessly swung towards the loathsomely greedy Ezra Zephyr's chest. Thuum. A muffled thump was heard, followed by a miserable cry. Ezra Zephyr's figure was thrown backwards, smashing one of the boulders of the cave as he arced across the air, before crashing into the ground with a yell of pain. Fenrir guffawed. "Haha, boy. You crossed the line, how could you forget that he is Hati, the one who hates haha." Ezra lay on the ground, hand clutched over his chest as he crawled up. The first thing he did was check that the bottle had not been broken, before breathing a sigh of relief. Next, he shook his head and said, "Petty fellow, it's just one more bottle." He massaged his painful chest. Hattie had been too vicious. But at least I got it. He gently swiveled the bottle in his hand as a look of joy appeared on his face. It was as Fenrir had said, Hattie's blood would make the early Tier 3 blood evolve into an early Tier 4 blood. "What are you doing?" While Ezra was elated inside, a lovely voice suddenly rang out from the side. He raised his head and saw Mahi and Gale standing nearby, her pretty face filled with confusion as she looked at him. The prince kept the jade bottle and grinned, "Nothing." He then asked, "Who brought you here?" Mahi hesitated for a moment, before she said, "I heard that you went to the Glittering Jewels Pavilion to purchase martial animal blood for the 8 lost dragons, but ended up being beaten to it by Drake." Ezra Zephyr's expression was calm as he nodded. He managed to buy up all of the peak Tier 3 martial animal blood. Mahi and Gale lightly clenched her teeth as fury flashed in her eyes. She had only despised Drake and Gale's actions. She suddenly jerked her hand, throwing a black shadow at Ezra Zephyr. The prince caught it in surprise, feeling a cool sensation as it entered his hands. It was another jade bottle, a wild and berserk aura spreading from the viscous blood flowing within. Peak Tier 3 dragon-type martial animal blood? Ezra Zephyr was startled. "I managed to pull some strings to get it from the official Outer Mountains, but I only have one," explained Mahi and Gale. Ezra Zephyr was rather astonished, evidently not expecting Mahi would help him obtain such an item. He immediately shook his head. "No need." Mahi waved her hand, cutting him off. "No need to be courteous. The grudge between you and Drake is ultimately due to my cousin. I will not stand by and do nothing." She looked at Ezra Zephyr and suddenly laughed as she teased, "I've heard that you told Drake Tubble you would take away number 1 from him in the peak selection ceremony. Word has already spread. Many are laughing at you for overestimating yourself." Ezra was speechless. He had not expected news of this to spread so quickly. "Looks like it was because of Drake again. I'm not the type to stir up trouble, but he's provoked me time and time again. It won't be me if I don't throw a punch back." Ezra chuckled. "Why, do you not fancy my odds? Rationality tells me that your chances are not good." Mahi's red lips pouted slightly. "However, I do hope to see you snatching away first place from him." Ezra Zephyr nodded. "I'll accept those good wishes then." Mahi and Gale was a direct and efficient individual. With a wave of her hand, she turned as she cast her gaze back towards the cave by the entrance. "Work hard. There's not much time left to the peak selection ceremony. I for one am really looking forward to your performance. Maybe you'll get a present from me." Her voice echoed within the mountain. The prince watched her figure disappear, before he began to swivel the bottle of Tier 3 martial animal blood. He peered into the distance, iciness filling his eyes as they narrowed. "Drake, taking away the blood means that there exists some wariness of me in your heart. Hence why you would resort to such methods to ensure nothing goes wrong. However, if you believe this will be enough to hinder me, I can only say that you're too naive. During the peak selection ceremony, the number 1 position you're so fixated on will be taken by me." The bright moon hung high in the sky, while a seated Ezra bathed in its gentle glow. 3 jade bottles stood in front of him, a savage and violent aura pulsing from the blood-red liquid within. They contained the blood of 3 Tier 3 dragon-type martial animals. As he gazed at the 3 bottles of blood, Ezra Zephyr briefly fell into thought, before he retrieved another bottle. Inside this bottle was blue blood that shined with a mysterious luster under the moonlight that leaked through a hole, a faint peculiar howl seemingly echoing from the blood. Hattie's blood seemed to contain a mysterious power. I wonder what Tier Hattie and Skull has to think that its blood can raise the quality of other martial animals' blood. Even Fenrir stayed quiet when asked. Mumbled Ezra Zephyr to himself. Hattie and Skull were not only overwhelmingly powerful, but also wielded a terrifying chaotic power that seemed to be capable of burning and freezing anything. Such a frightening abilities were clearly not something an ordinary martial animal would possess. It was rumored that Tier 4 martial animals had intelligence that did not lose to the martial masters. What's more, some martial animals with powerful bloodlines possessed amazing abilities that even the numerous powerful martial masters did not dare to underestimate. Are they Tier 5 martial animals? He thought. That's tantamount to spiritual transformation stage. Ezra shook his head, scattering these messy thoughts. The important thing now was to test if Hattie's blood was able to raise the quality of blood like Fenrir had claimed. The prince began to concentrate, one hand holding one of the bottles of blood, as the other very carefully dripped cerulean chilling blood into it. The moment the cerulean blood entered the bottle, its contents abruptly began to freeze. Cerulean light spread, infusing the originally blood-red blood with a faint cerulean glow. At this very moment, Ezra Zephyr felt the surrounding spiritual energy begin to converge towards the bottle. The blood-red martial animal blood supercooled as a faint bloody mist began to rise. The mist ultimately took the shape of a tiny python silhouette and released a soft hiss. The savage aura from the blood also steadily strengthened. Joy surged in Ezra's eyes when he saw this. As expected, Fenrir had been speaking the truth. Hattie's blood was indeed able to raise the quality of martial animal blood. According to his estimates, this martial animal blood, in terms of quality, was even superior to that from the Glittering Jewels Pavilion. This was an upgrade of an entire level. How terrifying! Ezra Zephyr involuntarily gasped. Although it was only a single bottle, one could already see how amazing Hattie's blood was. This information had to be kept secret at all cost. If not, it would surely draw the attention of many people, something that would be extremely detrimental to Hattie and Skoll. One must know that a Tier 3 martial animal was already equivalent to a Foundation Establishment expert, while the Foundation Establishment expert was considered elite even in a behemoth like Spirit Devouring Mountain. As for Tier 4 and Tier 5, they were existences that even the Spirit Devouring Mountain would not dare to offend. At the side of Spirit Devouring Mountain, a gigantic forest exists. It has 5 zones, each zone represents the tier of martial animals in it. No one is allowed to set foot in 4th zone and deeper, as at the territory of Tier 4 martial animals. That part of forest is called Dominion of Death. I should start refining the blood, and begin practicing the 8 lost dragons. Without further ado, Ezra Zephyr slammed his hands together, shattering the jade bottle. Red liquid rose, transforming into 2 thin streams of blood that were sucked into Ezra Zephyr's nostrils. The pungent scent of blood assaulted his senses, nearly making him puke, but Ezra Zephyr forcibly pushed down the urge. The martial animal blood immediately began to rebel the moment it entered his body, a savage aura spreading with the intent to invade. However, the prince was prepared. Black chaos lightning flickered over from all directions, surrounding the blood to prevent it from causing any harm to the body. The blood charged with all its might, making the insides of Ezra Zephyr's body shake violently. The savage aura continued to rise, stirring up vexed feelings in his heart. Red appeared in his eyes as the desire to destroy began to engulf him. However, the moment this urge rose, the sleeping wolf of Norse stood. Quit it, you possess no right to act arrogant with this feeble might of yours. The dominant existence of Fenrir rose, a cooling sensation spread, allowing him to regain his senses. It is indeed dangerous to refine martial animal blood. If the heart and mind are not strong, one will easily be infected by the savagery, entering a state of uncontrolled violence that would likely lead to the descent into madness. Ezra's heart beat in excitement, not daring to delay any further as he began to refine the blood in accordance to the instruction in the 8 lost dragons. Moonlight sprinkled onto the land. The prince sat on the ground, faint bloody mist rising from his pores, before being blown away by the wind. According to the 8 lost dragons, one needed to slowly whittle away the savageness inside the martial animal blood. Once this step was complete, one would be able to fuse the blood with one's own spiritual energy. The fusion of the two would bestow one the ability to release extremely berserk spiritual energy attacks. The most important factor for the whittling process was time, time that Ezra Zephyr was already prepared to spend. However, when he began to direct the Chaos Lightning spiritual energy, he discovered that every time his spiritual energy neared the martial animal's blood, the savage aura contained within seemed to be suppressed as if it was faintly trembling in fear. After observing this phenomenon a few times, Ezra could not help but feel somewhat puzzled. It seems that the Chaos Lightning has a special suppressive effect on dragon-type martial animal blood? Mumbled Ezra with uncertainty. The Chaos Lightning of yours does originate from the billions of martial spirits I have devoured and contains a little of primal aura. It is possible that this is why it has a suppressive effect on not only dragon type but all type of martial animals' blood. Ezra's heart jumped slightly at the message of Fenrir. If so, it would be much more convenient for him to whittle away the savageness in the blood. He immediately got to work, whittling away the savageness in the blood with his spiritual energy. Sure enough, the originally untamable and violent blood feebly gave up most of its resistance, allowing the Chaos Lightning to swiftly neutralize the savageness contained within it. After an entire night, the martial animal's blood in Ezra's body had grown much calmer. At this rate, he would be able to fully refine it in a few days. When that happened, he would have completed the initial step. Huh. A slightly pungent breath of air was puffed out from Ezra's mouth as his tightly shut eyes slowly opened. A look of satisfaction flitted across them. The night had been much more fruitful than expected. He had originally been prepared to spend a long time on this process. Who could have expected that his spiritual energy would be an exceptional match for the 8 lost dragons? I should be able to reach the first level of the 8 lost dragons in 3 more days. Anticipation flashed in Ezra Zephyr's eyes. He was itching to try the power of a high-tier gamma layer technique. The prince brushed his clothes and stood up. The moment he stood up, he saw 2 figures rapidly approaching from far away. When he concentrated, he saw that it was Ash Beckham and Gil Subzi. Both individuals were rushing towards his location, worried looks on their faces. Ezra Zephyr assumed that something serious has happened. The prince frowned slightly as his figure moved, like wind as it drifted forward and landed in front of the 2. "What is it?" he asked. Upon seeing Ezra Zephyr, Ash panted a few times before looking towards Ezra Zephyr with an ugly expression as he said, "Drake Tubble gathered many of the more highly ranked unofficial Outer Mountain disciples last night to fix the top 10 spots of the peak selection ceremony. He said that the Shurian and Ryan disciples are going to take 8 of them. If we from the other continents want to compete, we can only fight for the last 2 spots. Whoever breaks this rule will become an enemy of all the Shurian and Ryan disciples." Ash Beckham's expression turned complicated as he gazed at Ezra Zephyr. The unofficial Outer Mountains were currently in an uproar due to this news. Finally, he also said that you are the reason behind all of this. "I'm the reason, heh." Ezra Zephyr laughed slightly after hearing what they had to say. Drake Tubble was clearly doing this on purpose. He aimed to make the other continent's disciples resent Ezra Zephyr. When that happened, he and his continent would not only have to face hostility from the Shurian and Ryan disciples, but also the criticism of the disciples from the other continents. With unfriendliness from both sides, the Naren disciples' situation would not be good. There are already some other continent disciples that have begun to complain. They feel that it's clearly a grudge between only you and Drake Tubble, but it has now ended up implicating them. Ash Beckham smiled bitterly. If this continued, the prince would become highly criticized. Although Drake's tactics were underhanded, the prince felt that the disciples who blamed him were even more stupid. Gil's mouth pulled outwards as he said, "These guys only know how to bully the weak and fear the strong. They don't dare to voice their objections to Drake, so they made up another reason to vent their frustrations." Drake clearly knew that this would be the outcome, hence why he had acted so outrageously. After all, the title of the number 1 individual amongst the unofficial Outer Mountain disciples was a powerful deterrent force. Even though Ezra had defeated an official Outer Mountain disciple in a spiritual technique match, in the eyes of the disciples, he was still lacking what needed to be compared to Drake. Everyone felt Drake was very likely to become a well-known figure of this batch in the Spirit Devouring Mountain, and his prospects were practically limitless. Hence, they would naturally not dare to offend him. However, Ezra was of a different mind. "What did you say?" His tone changed, it carried a chaotic aura. Gil and Ash involuntarily flinched. "Your Majesty," I said, "they are afraid of Drake." "Oh, I said they bully us because we are weak dash." Crackle crackle. Before he could fully say it, the black lightning thundered. Ezra Zephyr raised his hand, and a bolt of lightning flickered and landed on a nearby hill. Boom crack crash. The moment the black and red lightning touched the hill, the seemingly unflinching and sturdy hill crumbled, rocks fell in a perpetual manner, and within seconds, the hill crumbled in a disgustingly crunching manner. "If I ever see you with that depressing rattle of yours again, I'll give you the experience that this hill went through." "It seems my forbearance drew a wrong image. You louts think that imp-looking feral creature is stronger than me," Ezra said in a declaring tone. He lowered his murdering aura when he saw Gil in sweat. He tapped his shoulder and said, "Gain some minor confidence, you craven milksop. You could have a harem if you had a good spirit and 5 years training program." Gil Subzi was bewildered. "I apologize, Your Majesty." That's all he could say. Ash Beckham, who was alarmed by Ezra's sudden change, shook his head and regained his senses. "Brother Ezra, I'm convinced that you are on par with Drake, but quite many people have complaints against you, while even more are very angry at Drake's overbearingness but can't do anything about it. According to these rules of his, the Shurian and Ryan disciples will be occupying 8 of the top 10 spots, leaving the rest of us to fight for the remaining 2. There are so many of us from the other continents, can you imagine how wretched and desperate the situation will be? TSK, you nitwit primates are worse than those were hyenas from Warborn Kingdom," he said regretfully. Ash Beckham blinked his eyes in confusion. Ezra counter-asked, "On what basis should we listen to him? Do the likes of him have the right to allocate these places? The top 10 spots of the peak selection ceremony should be contested based on one's own strength." "Who the hell is Drake, and how thick-skinned is he to think he could decide on how they should be split?" Ash smiled bitterly. "I've heard that the peak selection ceremony will be a free-for-all battlement, while the quality of the Shurian and Ryan disciples far surpasses the rest of us. Take the top 10 unofficial Outer Mountains disciples for example, a total of 7 are from them, 4 from Shurian continent and 3 from Ryan. Hence, when the time comes to vie for the top 10 spots of the peak selection ceremony, they will have the upper hand. What's more, they have Drake Tubble, whom no one has been able to come close to. Now that he has even brought together the Shurian disciples to decide the allocation of the top 10 spots, whoever tries to touch those spots would have to face all of the Shurian and Ryan disciples." Outside the cave, 3 youths were engaged in a hot chatter. Ash continued, "In the face of this power, the disciples from the other continents are merely akin to a plate of scattered sand. Who would dare to object? After all, once the other party is provoked, they can easily join hands in the peak selection ceremony to make things difficult. Let alone the top 10, one might be hard-pressed to even obtain a decent ranking. Even if we fight, they have Drake Tubble. And you have me and Naren continent disciples," the prince retorted. Ezra indifferently remarked, "In the end, it depends on whose fist is harder." He looked towards Ash Beckham as he continued, "I do not know whether the others will acknowledge his allocation, but with regards to my ranking, I'm afraid that they don't have the qualifications. Moreover, I'm not interested in the other spots either. The only thing I want in the peak selection ceremony is the first place." His tone was ordinary, but the words he spoke stunned Ash Beckham, but Gil knows the terror of his prince. It's just that being apart from the rest of Naren's disciples and working on an information network, the uninvited rumors haunted his heart and mind, causing some doubts. No one did not know that Drake had already declared first place was his. In the face of his overwhelming might, no one dared to have any opinions. Hence, practically everyone felt that Drake taking number 1 in his batch was already set in stone. Who could have expected Ezra Zephyr to also declare he wanted first place? As such, would this not mean that he would have to compete with Drake? Ash Beckham sighed before he said, "Brother Ezra, Drake will not be easy to deal with." I suspect that he has already reached the 4th level core formation stage. Most of the first-class disciples were at the 3rd level, and Drake was likely the only one who had reached the 4th. The prince laughed in a carefree manner. Whether or not he's easy to deal with, I'll find out when we fight. Ezra grinned. He wanted to see how grotesque Drake would look when the first place he coveted so much will be taken by him in the peak selection ceremony. Drake had repeatedly used various methods to make things difficult. If the prince bore with all this without counterattacking, he would not be the atrocious werewolf prince. Upon hearing this, Ash knew that Ezra had already made his decision. Looks like things were no longer going to be peaceful during the peak selection ceremony. However, Ash felt a little apprehensive. Although no one had a good grasp of Ezra's abilities except Naren's disciples, the one he was facing this time was not the likes of Moshi or Rashi, but Drake Tubble, a ruthless individual that was known to stand at the top of all the unofficial Outer Mountain disciples. Brother Ezra, if you're really planning on viewing for first place with Drake, I advise you to cooperate with some of the other continent disciples. They have already been enraged by Drake's overbearingness, and only lack someone to step up and take the lead. If Brother Ezra can get them on your side, you will not have to face the Shurian and Ryan disciples alone. Even though Naren disciples are powerful, but there is a limit. Ash Beckham suddenly suggested. Gil Subzi fell into thought for a while, before he said, I know some first-class disciples that are also unhappy with Drake. They will be a considerable force if you manage to recruit them. The prince fell silent for some time. In the end, he nodded. Drake had already gathered a huge group of 2 continents disciples, an alarming powerful force indeed. Although Ezra Zephyr did not feel that numbers meant victory, it was true that going alone would at times be more physically and mentally exhausting. The thing that stopped Ezra from throwing tantrum was the connections of Shurian and Ryan continents in Spirit Devouring Mountain. If he could recruit these other continent disciples to his cause, he would not lose to Drake in presence and position. When Ash saw Ezra nod, he continued to speak again. However, all of them are elites amongst the unofficial Outer Mountain disciples, the proud individuals who will not easily submit to anyone. Without sufficient strength, it will be very difficult to convince them. Drake had been able to become the leader of the Shurian disciples due to his strength. Even Ryan disciples came under him and left the side of Ravina in Gale. In contrast, there was no one amongst the other continent disciples like him who could sweep away everyone else with power. This led to the current situation in the unofficial Outer Mountains. The other continent's disciples formed their various groups and factions. Though they may seem to have the advantage due to their superior numbers, they were completely unable to match the Shurian and Ryan disciples. The only group who have defeated them is yours, Naren disciples. Ezra intended to caution Ezra as well as to inform him that only he is capable. After all, the former was worried that Ezra would be unable to control the situation after recruiting these proud and untamable individuals. If the situation turned into a farce, Ezra Zephyr would lose all face. Who amongst those who could come to the Spirit Devouring Mountain was not a prided genius? Everyone was full of pride, making it an uphill task to make them all voluntarily acknowledge a single person. At the very least, such a person had never appeared during the past 2 months. The prince naturally understood this. He softly chuckled and said, Brother Ash need not worry. You only need to call them over, and I'll handle the rest. With these words from the prince, there was nothing much for Ash to say, and he could only nod. Will depend on Brother Ezra's methods when the time comes. Ash Beckham was very efficient. By the time afternoon arrived, he had already invited over all of the outstanding individuals from other continents amongst the current batch of unofficial Outer Mountain disciples. In a certain little house by the mountain creek. The prince was seated on a rock, a dozen youthful figures seated before him. Robust spiritual energy spread from these figures, every action and gesture they made filled with a certain aura of pride. Most of the individuals who had been invited were after all elites amongst the first-class disciples. They were normally surrounded by many of their peers, enjoying the feeling of the world seemingly revolving around them. Hence, it was natural that they did not lack pride. Especially the 2 figures at the very front, a young lanky man and a well-statured woman. The young lady wore a long dark cyan dress, her fine black hair reaching to her waist. Her face was pretty, and her skin was white as snow. She was called Ray Lime and was quite well known amongst the unofficial Outer Mountain disciples. Due to her good looks, she had many admirers. The lanky male wore long gold robes, his hair scattered behind him. His wild-looking face gave off a proud aura. He was known as Rock. These two were also ranked amongst the top 10 unofficial Outer Mountain disciples, and could be said to be one of the rare few from the other continents that were able to vie with the Shurian and Ryan disciples. Ray appeared calm, though her eyes would covertly sweep towards Ezra Zephyr to examine him. Rock, on the other hand, was even more unbridled, his gaze uncourteously sizing up Ezra Zephyr, as if trying to discover the latter's bottom line. Ray inquired in a soft and gentle voice, "May I ask why Brother Ezra has gotten Brother Ash to gather us here?" The numerous disciples present cast their gazes over. If it was 2 months prior, not a single one of them would have answered Ezra's call. However, Ezra's reputation had recently risen, making no one dare to underestimate him. Thus, they decided to come here out of respect after listening to Ash Beckham's words. The prince's expression was calm as he gazed upon the group. There was no beating about the bush as he said, "I believe everyone has already heard of how Drake intends to divide the top 10 spots in the peak selection ceremony." Everyone could not help but frown slightly upon hearing this. Rock let out an icy chuckle. "This matter may even be related to Brother Ezra. Are you trying to say that if there was no feud between me and Drake, he would put up with you guys?" Ezra's scarlet eyes hardened slightly as he looked towards Rock and said in a cold voice, hoping for others to be more lenient and give you some scraps, "Is this all your dignity worth?" By the side, Ash Beckham was alarmed and Gil Subzi sighed. Ash was not expecting Ezra Zephyr's words to be so sharp even at the start. Sure enough, the numerous disciples present began to buzz angrily, rage filling their eyes as they looked towards Ezra Zephyr. Their proud selves were unable to accept the werewolf's words. Rock's complexion turned green with anger as he gnashed his teeth and said, "You do have a way with words, why not go reason with Drake?" A trace of unhappiness could also be seen on Ray Lime's pretty face as she said, "Brother Ezra, you should also know how powerful Drake Tubble is. What else can we do but be accommodating? If you asked us here only to humiliate us, then we will not accompany you any further." Ezra's eyelids lowered slightly as he looked towards the indignant crowd and said, "Looks like you guys still have a bit of fight in you. If not, it would have been meaningless to gather you." He shook his head, looking directly at them as he cut straight to the point. "I've asked all of you here to tell you that I intend to contest for first place with Drake in the peak selection ceremony. If you guys don't plan on struggling for those 2 pathetic spots, listen to my instructions when the time comes." Ash Beckham grabbed his face. Ezra's words were way too direct. It seemed as if he had no plans of trying to properly talk things out. Sure enough, the numerous disciples looked at each other, before sniggers began to emerge. "What shameless boasting. A second-level core formation like you intends to vie for first place with Drake?" Rock was the first to lose control. "How much did your arrogance swell after defeating Rashi in a spiritual technique match?" "Naive boy. Time is pressing for me, so I'm afraid that I can't afford to entertain your delusions any longer." Rock coldly snorted as he stood up, intending to leave. "What a bunch of rotten-head dunces. Do any of you have the balls to defeat your instructor in the spiritual technique that he teaches?" asked Ezra with mockery. These words flinched everybody, nobody dared to say yes. Regardless of how much they belittle Ezra's accomplishments, he without a doubt has made a legend. The prince continued. "You all are failures. You failed to join any enormous sect in your continent and had to come here, a dying sect that lost its position of first degree and has become a weak second-degree sect. Who do you think you are? Are you the best in your continent? No. Are you strongest? No. Am I the best in my continent? Yes. Am I strongest? Yes. Accept the reality and drop the curtains on your gold-rancid bazoo." The words of Ezra Zephyr fell like the rain of arrows, piercing every part of hearers. Ash Beckham shook her head. Ezra Zephyr seemed to be way too arrogant. The first part played its role, the second part for them to submit was to beat them till they were convinced. Hence, he immediately said, "If you find my words hard to digest, then receive a strike from me, and I will apologize right here, right now." Arrogant asshole. Rock's eyes widened as he laughed in anger. Rock laughed in anger, fury filled his eyes. Ezra Zephyr could no longer be bothered to speak, he said what he had to. He formed a seal with one hand before his palm suddenly flew forth. Thundering lightning chaos force abruptly cackled, akin to a web of black and red as it bolted out from Ezra's palm. When it surged out, it seemed to turn into a big bolt of lightning covered in red hints that released like a dragon. An extremely alarming aura violently unfurled. This palm strike had been imbued with the 8 lost dragons. The spiritual energy was faintly shaped like a giant lizard, it was the dragon-type martial animal blood Ezra Zephyr refined. However, it appeared somewhat indistinct because he had yet to fully refine it. Even so, the strike was imposingly powerful, tearing apart even the ground itself. A ferocious aura pounced towards Rock, causing his expression to change drastically. It was as if a Tier 3 martial animal was charging towards him, intending to trample him into the ground. He did not dare to delay. With a loud yell, spiritual energy also exploded from his body, the power of the 3rd level undoubtedly on full display. Boom! His foot slammed into the ground as his body shot forth like a flash of light, colliding with the roaring giant lizard made from spiritual energy. Wild winds devastated the surroundings, causing cracks to extend across the ground. Tom. Under the now stupefied gaze after gaze, the menacingly charging Rock was blown away by the giant lizard a split second later. He heavily crashed into a wall of the mountain, causing cracks to fill the entire wall. The area around the mountain creek was deathly silent. Ezra Zephyr was expressionless. With a wave of his sleeve, the giant spiritual energy lizard returned to his hand. Rock fell from the mountain wall and crashed into the ground as he spat out a mouthful of blood. He raised his head, shock and fear in his eyes as he looked towards Ezra Zephyr, evidently never expecting his 3rd level of strength to be incapable of receiving even a single blow from Ezra Zephyr. Ray's red lips were slightly ajar, her full chest heaving as she stared deeply at the prince. "Is there anyone else who wants to leave?" The prince's voice was shockingly calm, and a wicked grin decorated his face. Silence. Everyone was silent, not daring to make any noise. The scrutiny from before had now completely vanished. One must know that Rock was ranked 7th amongst the 10 great Outer Mountain disciples. However, even someone like him had been defeated in a single strike. How terrifyingly powerful did one have to be to achieve such a feat? They believed that no matter how strong Ezra Zephyr was, he would at most be a little stronger than them. Yet, the scene before their eyes made them understand how wrong they had been. "Are you guys going to listen now?" Ezra's gaze swept across them. Anyone who came into contact with it hurriedly lowered their heads in embarrassment. Ray's red lips parted slightly, and apologetically said, "We were blind earlier, I hope that Brother Ezra Zephyr does not blame us too much." Ezra smiled. "Beauty with brains, just to let you know, you look amazingly beautiful in cyan color." Ezra beguiled the lady with coaxing praise. Ray's eyes widened and her cheeks turned red, she lowered her face as she blushed. Rock wiped away the blood at the corner of his mouth. He was a straightforward person, so after being utterly defeated by Ezra, he did not leave, but instead returned and sat down again. "You're good, and I was the one who was blind earlier. Go ahead and let us know what should be done." The strength Ezra displayed had subdued them, causing certain thoughts to rise in their minds. Perhaps Ezra did have the power to contend against Drake. Ash secretly breathed a sigh of relief. All of these guys were indeed miserable bastards. When words were used, they refused to listen, and only after being beaten did they submit. The prince glanced at Rock and said, "First, we will not accept their suggestion of leaving us only 2 of the top 10 spots." Everyone exchanged a look. Of course, they did not want to accept it. "What do we do about Drake?" "He said we have to go find him if we have any objections." asked someone. Ezra's expression was uncaring. He can come and suck my dick. Spread the word that we want all 10 of the top 10 spots. The Shurian and Ryan disciples won't get a single one. Cold sweat emerged on the heads of Rock and the rest, even Ray's lips stretched slightly taut as she forced a smile. Are you insane? How will they agree to this? The prince offhandedly said, if they disagree, we'll see which of us is more skilled in the peak selection ceremony. Someone weakly said, with regards to quality, the Shurian and Ryan disciples are indeed a little stronger than us. I'm afraid that we won't be able to do much. Ezra's gaze swept across the group as he said, firstly, the 6 of 10 spots will be taken by Naren disciples. So, their biggest enemies would be me and Naren's disciples. As for the remaining 4, Ash Beckham, Rock and Ray Lime will get each, and the last one will be given to Mahi and Gale, as she was the first one to believe me, excluding my people. Secondly, I will help you improve your spiritual techniques. Ray Lime, Rock and the rest's eyes could not help but brighten. They knew that Ezra seemed to be astonishingly talented in practicing spiritual techniques. If they had his guidance, they may even raise their strength to the next level. In return, all of you have to listen to me during the peak selection ceremony. Whoever I direct you guys at, you guys will go and beat up. Any objections? The prince slowly uttered. This time everyone nodded one after another, their eyes filled with burning excitement. At the rear, Ash Beckham and Gil Subzi inwardly sighed in admiration upon seeing this. This was truly a beautiful move from Ezra. First, taunt them with disrespectful words, then intimidate them like a blast of thunder, before dangling a carrot in front of their eyes. All of these normally untamable elite disciples were immediately subdued into obedience. Ezra Zephyr had suddenly changed from a remote continent's disciple to an existence that was now able to match Drake's reputation and his coalition gang of Shurian and Ryan disciples. Ash Beckham licked his lips as a fire began to burn in his eyes. All of a sudden, the peak selection ceremony in a month was going to be an electrifyingly exciting event. News of Ezra recruiting elite disciples from other continents swiftly spread in the unofficial outer mountains, undoubtedly causing a giant wave to rise. Of course, the declaration Ezra made next was even more shocking. For the top 10 spots, the non-Shurian disciples would take all, while the Shurian and Ryan won't even get one. These words were akin to the impetus for a volcanic eruption, with numerous Shurian disciples openly mocking them. Haha, this is the joke of the century. Ever since the Spirit Devouring sect was founded, there have never been less than 5 Shurian disciples amongst the top 10 in the peak selection ceremony. Such shameless bragging from a werewolf boy. Who does he think he is? Can't imagine how he dares to allocate the top 10 spots. Looks like he's lost his mind. Does he believe he's superior to Drake? Well, if we see it that way, he sure has potential to rival Drake. Ezra Zephyr has such big guts, I wish I had half of his. No, even a quarter would be great. No way, we Shurian disciples are blessed by the heavens, and should naturally enjoy the better treatment. Who does Ezra think he is? I heard that he even plans on vying for first place with brother Drake. What a joke. Haha, you Shurian disciples are damn arrogant. How many of you in the sect's history has defeated the instructor in the spiritual technique that he teaches? No one, 0, right? Don't be his advocate, let's see how he'll take responsibility for his words this time. Truly a fool who doesn't know the immensity of the heavens. The unofficial outer mountains descended into boiling anger, a tsunami of opposition exploding from the Shurian disciples as if they had been humiliated. In response to the enormous ruckus, even more non-Shurian disciples inwardly curled their lips. Where was all this self-righteousness when you guys decided that you would be taking 8 of the top 10 spots and leaving 2 for us as charity? Thus, they came forward and defended the pride of Ezra Zephyr. Now that someone had finally stood up amongst the non-Shurian disciples, these guys were acting as if they had been utterly humiliated, and would never let this matter drop. Hence, many non-Shurian disciples applauded Ezra's decision to bravely step forward. Although some of them, who were unaware of Ezra, did not know why he dared to so openly face Drake Tubble, it was better than before, when everyone was so afraid of Drake that no one had the courage to even raise his or her head. However, they did feel somewhat awkward. This matter would certainly draw violent backlash from the Shurian disciples, a backlash that they did not know whether Ezra Zephyr would be able to deal with. If he failed, his bold declaration would only turn into a joke, making them have to bow their heads even lower in front of the proud Shurian disciples. The training sessions here were not missed by a single unofficial Outer Mountain disciple, with the exception of some Naren disciples. However, there was something different about the atmosphere today, a faint hint of tenseness and hostility in the air. Countless gazes sneaked glances towards a certain spot near the peak, where Ezra was seated on his prowess platform with his eyes closed, no hint of any other emotion on his calm face. Many gazes also looked towards another prowess platform nearby, where dressed entirely in white, was Drake Tubble, an equally nonchalant look on his face. The atmosphere covering Energy Mountain was strangely tense. This lasted for a long time, before a figure suddenly stood up. It was a young man with fierce eyes, and vigorous spiritual energy pulsing around his body. It was Toria. He was not some unknown individual, but the number 6 amongst the 10 unofficial Outer Mountain disciples. He looked towards the prince with hostility, before lifting his leg as he began stomping menacingly towards the ladder. Figure after figure also stood up, following behind him. Their eyes were filled with toying looks as they gazed towards Ezra Zephyr. A dozen figures soon gathered. All of them were first-class disciples, while also from the Shurian continent. Any one of them usually objected to admiration and respect. When all of them were gathered together, they became an exceptionally intimidating force. The expressions of several non-Shurian disciples changed slightly, feeling somewhat nervous. From the looks of it, these Shurian disciples were going to cause trouble for Ezra Zephyr. That's Toria, ranked 6th amongst the Outer Mountain disciples. Do you see the silver-haired young man beside him? That's Usopp, an even more formidable character that's ranked 4th amongst the Outer Mountain disciples. The others are no ordinary individuals too. It seems that they don't have friendly intentions. Numerous whispers spread as every gaze on Energy Mountain shifted over. When Usopp, Toria, and the rest menacingly walked towards Ezra Zephyr, the expressions of Ash Beckham, Rock, Ray Lime and the gang changed slightly. How could they not know what the other party was up to? Their gazes immediately converged, and a split second later, figure after figure stood up and gathered behind the trio, before moving to stand in front of Ezra Zephyr. Countless gazes watched the two parties that were about to collide, their hearts jumping erratically in their chests. These two groups were basically composed of the elites amongst this batch of Outer Mountain disciples. If they were to clash, it would be an earth-shaking event. Usopp, Toria, what are you guys planning on doing? Asked Ray in a low voice. You three. He gestured at Ash, Ray, and Rock. Scram. There was an ominous look in Toria's eyes, no trace of any civility in his words. Powerful spiritual energy burst from his body as a suffocating pressure spread. Toria, do you think I'm made from mud? Rock was also a proud individual. His eyes immediately hardened as he too stepped forward, violence brimming from his eyes as he looked towards Toria. Oh, have your balls grown, Rock? Do you really believe you've found a reliable backer? Toria's tone was filled with ridicule. Rock's gaze turned icy. Spiritual energy swirled around his hands as they faintly expanded, undulations violently pulsing from them. By Toria's side, the silver-hair youth called Usopp spoke up in an indifferent voice, Rock, this matter does not concern you guys. I advise you to open your eyes a little wider, and not be so easily tricked by others. There are some people who have no ability, but wield their tongues with impeccable finesse. His gaze seemed to sweep to the back, where black-dressed Ezra Zephyr was seated, clearly putting no effort to conceal the disdain within them. Ray's lips opened slightly as she calmly said, what we do is our own business. There's no need for Brother Usopp's concern. Usopp coldly snorted. Sister Ray, in our previous bout, your black shadow art really caught me off guard. However, I've now mastered the sunlight law, so feel free to come at me again. Ray frowned a little upon hearing this. She naturally knew that the sunlight law just so happened to counter the black shadow art she practiced. Toria coldly chuckled, no longer bothering with them as his gaze looked straight towards the prince. Ezra Zephyr, didn't you say that we Shurian disciples cannot occupy any of the top 10 spots? We're here to find out what right you have to say such things. His expression turned serious as he stepped forward, his thunderous voice rumbling across the entire energy mountain. So get your ass over here. If you don't give us an explanation today, you will not be able to walk out of Energy Mountain. Usopp and Toria's thunderous voices echoed, causing the hearts of countless disciples to jump in their chests. From the looks of it, these Shurian disciples intended to deal with Ezra today. They obviously knew that Ray Lime and the rest derived their confidence from Ezra Zephyr, so as long as they were able to force him into submission in front of everyone here, the other disciples would naturally understand that the dignity of the Shurian disciples was not to be challenged. Gaze after gaze converged on Ezra Zephyr. Toria sternly looked at Ezra and said, "MHM. Lowly werewolf, if you apologize to us Shurian disciples today, we can act as if we never heard those words you said previously. Or else, we Shurian disciples will not let this go." Rock was practically about to explode due to Toria's overbearingness. The former's rage channeled into a single laugh as he said, "If you want to play, I'll happily accompany you." Spiritual energy also began to surge around Ashbeckham and Ray Lime, a sharp iciness brimming in their eyes. Behind them, the non-Shurian disciples also got ready to fight. After all, Toria and the rest were being way too outrageous. If they were allowed to do as they pleased with Ezra Zephyr, the non-Shurian disciples would no longer have any hopes of rising up against the Shurian disciples. The one who causes trouble should be the one to resolve it. Rock, you guys should stop airing any further. However, just as Rock and the rest were about to act, a faint voice was suddenly heard. It seemed to bring with it a mighty pressure that instantly made the surging spiritual energy around Rock and the rest grow sluggish. Rock and gang's expressions changed as they lifted their heads, to find Drake Tubble indifferently looking towards them on his prowess platform nearby. In the face of Drake's gaze, Rock and the rest immediately felt an indescribable pressure, as if they would be truly suppressed by Drake if they were to go any further. As the number one individual amongst the Outer Mountain disciples, Drake's presence made others extremely wary. "You chicken-hearted thing, all you do is hide far to the rear and come up with all kinds of underhanded tactics. Do you really believe sending trash like them will achieve anything?" While Rock and the gang's expressions were fluctuating indeterminately, a calm voice broke the deadlock. Countless gazes looked over, only to see that Ezra had opened his eyes, and was now looking straight at Drake, his words clearly referring to the latter. Drake's eyes hardened slightly. "All you have is a sharp tongue, and the reason why I don't personally deal with the likes of you is because I do not feel that you have the qualifications." "What do you mean by trash like them? What right does a mere second-level core formation have to put on such airs?" Toria's expression darkened as he ferociously glared at Ezra, evidently angered by the latter's earlier words of disdain. "Do you think the likes of you are worthy enough for Brother Drake to take action?" The prince's gaze turned a little colder as he looked towards Toria, shaking his head as he said, in a soft voice, "Reckless fool. What did you say?" Toria's rage hit its peak. The manner in which Ezra viewed the former as insignificant was really grating hard on his nerves. He truly could not understand why Ezra Zephyr would have the gall to show such an attitude towards him. The prince shook his head, deciding not to waste any more time arguing. He lazily raised his hand and waved it slightly. Whoosh, swoosh. Everybody heard the sound of gusting winds, and soon after, hundreds of Naren disciples arrived. Unlike other disciples, they kept a very low profile since the first day. However, the current powerful spiritual energy around them was terrifying. Especially, the 5 that were in the lead. "These right here are what you call top-tier subordinates. If you like games, then I'll provide you with players." Ezra grinned. "Out of the way, watch me kill him with a single punch today," howled Toria as ferocious spiritual energy exploded. His hands rapidly expanded as faint glowing runes appeared, giving off an endless aura of forceful unyieldingness. Light flickered in his pupils, detecting a blurry figure dash towards him from an angle. Die! With a fierce cry, his palm suddenly chopped downwards, creating a dozen feet long dipper energy that tore open a glossy deep cut in the ground below. However, his deadly strike landed on a different spot. The blurry figure seemed to stand in front of Ezra Zephyr, and when they saw the blurry figure they found out that it was their Gale arms, who parried the attack of Toria. Just shielding yourself with people, do you believe you're a turtle? Ridicule was revealed in Toria's eyes. Ezra Zephyr made a mocking face as he said, "That was the lamest insult I have ever heard in my life, you are cringe." Eliminate this synonym of shit, his face is hurting my eyes. Haha, as you wish, your majesty. Thor replied with a laugh as if he was waiting for this moment. When Ezra said that, their Gale arms vanished from sight. Where did he go? Toria asked himself in shock. Usopp yelled. Above. What is it? Toria was immediately alarmed, and also jerked his head upwards, only to find their Gale arms descending with his body spinning rapidly. Astonishing waves of golden spiritual energy came out of his body, and both of his hands held the curved swords. It was a mid-tier gamma layer technique. That's God's speed. How did he manage to learn it? Toria's pupils shrank violently. Under countless gazes tinged with alarm and shock, Thur descended down at astonishing speed. God's vortex. Golden light abruptly exploded from him as the surrounding spiritual energy rapidly swept over. In the short span of a few seconds, their Gale arms transformed into a giant spiritual energy vortex that was over 30 meters tall. The vortex began to descend, crushing down on Toria. Fear rose on Toria's face as he hastily circulated his spiritual energy, both arms reaching out to push back. Ugh! However, his hands bled the moment his hands came into contact with the vortex. It was indescribably heavy and barbed, pushing down on him till his entire body began to creak. An intense sharp pain spread along his arms, making them feel as if they were about to snap. His body was forced down bit by bit, nothing changing no matter how he held. The vortex seemed to have a spiritual energy suppressive effect. Once touched, it would continuously seal away and suppress one's spiritual energy while acutely cutting the prey. Countless gazes all over the vortex watched in shock as Toria was easily suppressed and injured by the move of God's speed spiritual technique. No one had expected their Gale arms to be capable of employing such an attack. To think that his God speed mastery had reached such a level. Toria. Usopp and gang turned pale with fright, evidently completely unable to imagine that Toria would be suppressed by their after a single exchange. They gritted their teeth and shot forward, intending to help. However, when they were a few feet from Toria, a fire dome suddenly began rising from the ground, like an incomparably hot dome of fire that cut Toria off from the outside world. It was the next Jin of Cult XYR's move. Usopp and gang frantically attacked the fire dome, causing it to shake violently. Although the dome looked as if it would not last for long, inside it, Toria looked even worse off as he desperately tried to endure. Ezra Zephyr gazed at the bitterly persevering Toria and asked in an indifferent voice, "Are you convinced now?" Toria's face twisted as he redoubled his efforts to withstand the giant vortex. His entire body trembled uncontrollably as it dripped with sweat, unable to say even a single word. By the side, Ray Lime, Rock and the rest involuntarily swallowed at this scene. They never imagined the powerful Toria would be forced into such a miserable state by the subordinate of Ezra Zephyr. Although it was partly because Toria had been caught off guard, Thur's mastery over his spiritual technique had exceeded everyone's expectations. When they looked towards Ezra Zephyr, there was now a faint unfathomable feeling. They were not the only ones. Even the other disciples now looked towards Ezra with respect. Ezra Zephyr, tell your dog to better not hurt him. When Toria was rapidly approaching his last legs, Drake was finally no longer able to restrain himself. He had originally intended for Toria and the gang to embarrass Ezra Zephyr, causing the weak alliance he had created to fall to pieces. But he never expected that Ezra would have such remarkable martial masters at his bay. Not only had Drake failed to strike a blow to Ezra's reputation, but it had also ended up growing instead. If Drake allowed Toria to be killed by their gale arms before his eyes, his reputation would be harmed. However, Ezra did not show even the slightest response to Drake's shout. "Ezra, this is too much." Iciness flashed in Drake's eyes, no longer hesitating as he violently jerked his sleeve. A dozen feet wide torrents of spiritual energy swept forth, surging towards the giant vortex. He had finally made his move. The prince's gaze flashed as the short sword in his hand also jerked. The sword named Efsa gleamed, its bluish hue seemingly turning into a stream of sky color as it whizzed forth. Black lightning danced around Efsa as it smashed into the spiritual energy flood. P-alpha and D-alpha, no, 1-0 boom. A violent explosion swept outwards. The short sword Efsa knocked away before it returned to Ezra. At this instant, however, Ezra Zephyr extended a hand and said, "Kill him." The giant vortex shook as it suddenly pushed down with more power. Thor was using every bit of his power to crush the enemy. "Ah!" screamed Toria. The god's vortex powerfully slammed into the ground, flattening his entire body. It was a very miserable sight. He was covered in gashes and blood. "I yield. I yield," he screamed, no longer able to bear the pain. A flood of spiritual energy blasted the giant vortex, blowing Thor away. Thor balanced himself in midair and landed on the ground. Specks of light seemed to dance as they filled the sky. The entire energy mountain was deathly silent as countless gazes looked towards Drake, the latter's handsome face currently an angry shade of steely green. He darkly glared at Thor as a terrifying aura began to rise from his body. A split second later, he turned his eyes to Ezra and an eerily cold voice slowly rang out from his mouth. "Filthy werewolf, you are dead meat now." When Drake's bone-chilling voice rang out, an alarming torrent of spiritual energy ferociously exploded from his body like a storm. Cracks began to extend on the ground below his feet. The expression of the numerous disciples in the vicinity changed slightly, somewhat unable to bear the spiritual energy pressure as they backed away. A sliver of fear flitted across the eyes of Rock, Ray Lime, Ash Beckham and the rest when they looked towards Drake, now understanding the gap between them and the latter. As the true blue number one disciple of the Outer Mountains, Drake Tubble was someone they both feared and respected. The surrounding disciples retreated one after another. Only Ezra Zephyr remained seated on his prowess platform, his eyes were akin to a cold blade as he stared at Drake Tubble. He waved his hand and all the weaker Naren disciples took some steps back, only the top 5 remained with him. "Why? Are you finally no longer able to sit still?" said Ezra in a frosty voice. The black lightning thundered inside its body as it danced around his body. Drake's eyes were akin to a brewing storm, tinged with the occasional flash of rage. It had been his will for Toria and the gang to go after Ezra with the intention of suppressing the latter, making him lose all respect in the hearts of the Nanturian disciples. However, Drake had not expected Ezra to respond so swiftly and decisively. Moreover, it was also the first time he had witnessed the latter's abnormally strong subordinates. Although Ezra's martial prowess was only at the second-level core formation stage, he was capable of leading such powerful men. Their gale arms suppressed Toria, who was at third level. In conclusion, in terms of people and subordinates, Drake was no match for Ezra. This outcome was completely opposite to what Drake had intended, hence why he was no longer able to watch and do nothing. "You arrogant and ignorant fool. I originally wanted to save you for the peak selection ceremony, but since you're already unable to wait, I will show you today that you are merely an ugly little dog in my eyes." Drake's ice-cold voice rang out. The spiritual energy in his body grew more and more vigorous, turning into a howling gale that screamed around his body. Spiritual energy transformed into countless green blades of wind that began to shred even the air itself. Imposing and terrifying. I've long wanted to see exactly what qualifications you have to be the so-called number one of the unofficial Outer Mountains. Ezra's gaze was cold and piercing, his black coat flapping loudly as the black lightning thundered. Their auras ferociously clashed, causing a hostile atmosphere to choke the entire energy mountain. Every disciple secretly wet their lips at this sight. No one had imagined that even in the face of someone as formidable as Drake, Ezra would still meet the former head-on, refusing to give even an inch. Were the two most talked-of individuals recently finally going to clash for real today? Numerous disciples opened their eyes a little wider, a sliver of curiosity and anticipation contained within. All of you stop. However, when Ezra Zephyr and Drake Tubble's gazes were growing increasingly chilling, a loud shout was suddenly heard. A thunderous voice swept downwards along with boundless spiritual energy, directly suppressing both Ezra and Drake. Innumerable disciples lifted their heads, only to see a man flying over. Eldarine stood atop them, while a pretty chubby blue figure stood beside him. It was Mahi and Gale. Eldarine looked down from above, staring at Ezra and Drake as he frowned and said, "The peak selection ceremony is just around the corner. If you have any grudges, you can resolve them then. Don't even think about having any personal squabbles here." The truth was that he had long known about what was going to happen today. Hence, he had intentionally been missing today. After all, Ezra Zephyr was a sore sight in his eyes, and he was naturally happy to let Drake Tubble teach the former a lesson. However, Eldarine had not expected Mahi and Gale to come knocking at his door, giving him no choice but to rush over. After all, Mahi and Gale's background was too great, and he did not want to offend her. Yin's appearance meant that there would no longer be a battle between Ezra and Drake. Both of them exchanged an icy glance, before withdrawing the surging spiritual energy around their bodies. "Ezra Zephyr, you'd better treasure what time you have left. When the peak selection ceremony arrives, I will personally pummel you into the abyss. Then, you will know that you amount to nothing in my eyes." Drake stood with his hands behind his body, his eerily chilling gaze directed straight at Ezra. Their grudge had started with Ravina and Gale, but now, Drake would still view Ezra as an enemy even without her. Because Drake could already feel that Ezra was beginning to threaten his position. In the past, Ezra had merely been an ant in his eyes, not even worthy of any attention. Later on, however, Drake began to observe Ezra's astonishing rise amongst the unofficial Outer Mountains disciples, the concealed sharp blade he was no longer able to be hidden. Drake had begun to feel threatened, and he could not tolerate a disciple from this continent challenging his position and prestige. As the one at the forefront of this batch of unofficial Outer Mountain disciples, he needed to win, because this would also decide his future prospects and position in the Spirit Devouring Mountain. Therefore, he must destroy Ezra Zephyr. The prince could sense the intense evilness in Drake's eyes, however, it did not bother him at all as he softly chuckled and said, "I'll send these words right back at you. I hope that you won't die too miserably, or it will really be boring. You think you are worthy?" Drake was expressionless, contempt appearing from the corners of his mouth. As for Ian, he merely showed the minimum courtesy of cupping his hands together with a cold expression. Ian had always been the one to oversee the Energy Mountain training sessions, and yet, he had found some excuse to be absent today. This was obviously intentional, and he had likely known in advance that Toria and the gang would be stirring up trouble today. Hence, Ezra Zephyr guessed that Ian had purposely created an opportunity for Toria and the gang to do so. In view of this, Ezra Zephyr naturally was not going to happily thank Ian. Eldarine was likewise able to see Ezra's half-heartedness, causing the former to snort inside. However, he did not get angry. Elder Rustum's sudden appearance to help Ezra previously had clearly made Eldarine wary. He no longer dared to so casually cause trouble for Ezra Zephyr. "Let's go," said Ezra Zephyr to the Regale Arms, Zulfi Dimitri, Argus Waska, Shifa Pista, and XYR, before he turned and walked towards the foot of the mountain. A wave of respect flowed out in the eyes of Ray Lime, Rock and the other first-class disciples as they gazed upon Ezra. His almost effortless suppression of Toria and direct confrontation of Drake Tubble had completely won over these usually headstrong disciples. Drake's suppression was the reason why they had previously feared competing with the Shuryan disciples, but now, Ezra had appeared on their side. As such, they no longer feared Drake as much as before. With such thoughts in mind, they exchanged a look, began to follow one after another, creating a crowd behind Ezra. With them taking the lead, more and more non-Shurian disciples began to flood over, forming a black mass that surged down the mountain. The sight of this caused the expressions of numerous Shurian disciples to turn somewhat unnatural. For the first time, they felt that these country bumpkins were no longer easy targets. The corners of Drake's lips involuntarily twitched at this sight, fury boiling within his eyes. In a certain manner of speaking, this was akin to stepping on their faces. He never imagined that he would not only fail to destroy Ezra, but end up helping him instead, creating a central pillar that all these country bumpkins could now rally around. Drake Tubble took in a deep breath, his 5 fingers slowly clenching into a fist. The gaze that stared at Ezra Zephyr's back was filled with a chilling iciness. Go ahead and be happy for now. During the peak selection ceremony, I will personally stomp you into the ground. I will teach you that the higher you climb, the harder the fall. After the confrontation on Energy Mountain, the atmosphere in the unofficial outer mountains grew increasingly tense. Various clashes happening between the Shurian and non-Shurian disciples time and time again. However, there was one change compared to before. The non-Shurian disciples no longer tolerated the bullying of the Shurian disciples, fiercely striking back instead, causing the Shurian disciples to be caught off guard, and in that game Naren disciples played the front role. After all, the Shurian disciples had only been able to act so proud and arrogant because Drake had the power to sweep away all the other disciples, making many disciples afraid to even raise any objections against him. However, after the confrontation between Ezra and Drake on Energy Mountain, the non-Shurian disciples suddenly realized that there was someone amongst them that had deeply concealed his abilities. If this was the case, why should they continue to be accommodating and show tolerance to these guys? Therefore, even though the day of the peak selection ceremony was fast approaching, conflicts constantly rose between the two sides, each wanting to force the other into submission. With regards to the disagreements between the disciples, the Spirit Devouring Mountain showed no concern, allowing them to do as they pleased. It was an unspoken rule in the Spirit Devouring Mountain. Although the Spirit Devouring Mountain was a titan-like existence in Naren continent, competition was needed for sustained growth. And amongst all the other sects, Spirit Devouring Mountain is cruelest. They follow the rule of might is right. That's why the other sects were wary of Spirit Devouring Mountain, they called them demons. The clashes between the Shurian and other continent disciples would allow them to polish each other, propelling them to strive even harder in their prowess. From a certain point of view, it was a kind of motivation. As for the disciples that were unable to adapt to such competition, they would eventually be eliminated. However, while such disagreements continued to break out between the disciples, Ezra's reputation began to rise at an alarming speed, until it was basically equal to Drake's. Ezra was now known as one of the top contenders amongst unofficial Outer Mountain disciples of this batch. Of course, this was an opinion mostly shared by non-Shurian disciples. The Shurian disciples, on the other hand, merely viewed this with extreme contempt. They believed that if it was not for Elder Yin's interference, Ezra Zephyr would have long been beaten back to his original shape on Energy Mountain. When all was said and done, however, Ezra's reputation in the unofficial Outer Mountains was now no lesser than Drake's. As for who exactly amongst the two would become the true number one, everyone would only find out during the peak selection ceremony. Rear Mountains. Currently, the prince was still giving guidance for the Gossamer Steps technique every day, as if he doesn't give a shit about Drake. Drake was no ordinary individual. Although he was loathsome, his strength was admittedly the real deal, but Ezra always grinned whenever Drake was mentioned. While focusing on training his own people, Ezra also started to fulfill his promise towards Rock, Ray Lime and the rest, the promise of giving them pointers in their spiritual techniques. After all, he had already recruited them, and would also require their help in the peak selection ceremony. Thus, raising their strength would also end up benefiting himself. By a certain mountain creek, Ezra Zephyr sat on a boulder, his gaze looking first towards Rock as he said, "The spiritual energy technique you practice is the Land Vandal Hand, right?" The Land Vandal Hand was a mid-grade gamma layer technique. It was powerful and unyielding in nature, and every strike would be accompanied by earth. Attribute. Even metal would seem akin to butter before its might. At the advanced level, smashing apart mountains would be an effortless task. It was as if a bolt of energy surged through Rock, while anticipation also began bubbling in the eyes of Ray Lime and the rest also. After so many days, Ezra Zephyr was finally going to begin guiding them. The past few days had been rather vexing for them. They had heard whispers that Drake had managed to pull some strings, and arranged for personal tutors to guide some of the better-ranked unofficial Outer Mountain disciples such as Toria and Usopp, allowing them to rapidly grow stronger. This news made them feel very uneasy. After all, if the gap started to widen, their chances of winning would drop in the peak selection ceremony, making it extremely difficult to vie for the top 10 spots. However, they did not have the connections Drake had, and were thus unable to obtain personal guidance from these tutors. Hence, they could only place their hopes on Ezra Zephyr. However, the prince had not even hinted at this matter for the past few days, leaving them no option but to wait in silence. Now that Ezra had finally voluntarily brought it up, they were naturally elated. However, there was still a little doubt mixed in with this happiness. After all, although they knew that Ezra Zephyr seemed to have astonishing talent in spiritual techniques, each of them practiced a different technique. Would Ezra be proficient in all of them? Hence, with regards to Ezra's promise to give them guidance, they were still holding a seeing is believing mindset. Rock felt a little awkward as he asked, "Brother Ezra, will you really be able to help me with the land vandal hand technique? You've yet to see its prowess method, right?" Ezra nodded and said, "I've not seen it before." He had indeed not seen the prowess method for the land vandal hand. However, he possessed the unlimited talent and Fenrir, and could clearly find the weaknesses or deficiencies in any spiritual technique. Therefore, he only needed to bring their attention to places, naturally allowing them to avoid making such mistakes, allowing them to progress more efficiently. This was something that no other instructor could do. Of course, this was the extent of the aid he could give. Each individual had to continue spending time practicing and better understanding their techniques to improve. All Ezra had was talent, he doesn't possess any decoding treasure. Rock could not help but let out a bitter laugh in response to Ezra's honesty. There are 3 levels to the land vandal hand. I've managed to master the first level, but I'm having difficulties with the second for quite some time. The one you suppressed a few days ago, Toria, also practices this technique. I've heard he's made significant progress during the past 2 days, and will likely reach the second level before the peak selection ceremony. Rumor says that Drake has found some instructors to personally guide them. At this point, Rock grinded his teeth in regret. The disciples from the Shurian continent did have several advantages over the rest of them. Ezra gave a slight nod upon hearing this. He was naturally also aware of this piece news. It was this very information that caused the minds of Rock, Ray, Ash and the rest to wander, and also hence why Ezra had brought up this matter today. If he were to delay any further, Rock and gang would likely soon lose their morale, let alone the other disciples. This was obviously another one of Drake's schemes that aimed to destroy everyone's faith. The prince did not want to waste any more time, and directly instructed, "Activate the land vandal hand." The sight of Ezra's calm appearance made Rock feel a little less awkward. It seemed that he had some confidence. Rock took in a deep breath as the spiritual energy inside his body began to ripple. His hands started to grow a little, spiritual energy light swirling around them to form glowing patterns. Sections of Vandal Earth attribute formed on his hands, powerful enough to shatter the ground. With a loud yell, Rock swung his hand. Earth-made shards immediately swept forth, chopping open a 90 feet long cut on the ground in front of him, the dreadful force splitting even the boulders in its path. The surrounding disciples inwardly sighed in amazement. The land vandal hand was indeed ferocious and domineering. The levels of the land vandal hand are marked by the power of the Vandal Earth shards. It's said that the second level can reach over 240 feet, while I am currently only capable of about 90 feet. Said Rock in a somewhat regretful manner. But my progress has slowed to a crawl recently, only making 3 feet of headway after several days of non-stop practice. At this rate, it will take at least half a year to reach the second level. "Brother Ezra, what do I need to do?" He gazed the prince, with a flash of hope in his eyes. The others also awkwardly looked towards Ezra. If he could solve Rock's problem, they would naturally have more faith. Ezra's eyes narrowed and he called Fenrir. When Rock used the land vandal hand earlier, he had clearly seen how the spiritual energy circulated along the channels and meridian points in the latter's body. At certain locations, Ezra had sensed the circulating spiritual energy turn a little sluggish. While Ezra did not speak, everyone else fell silent, causing the atmosphere to become extremely suffocating. Moments later, the prince finally withdrew his gaze. He looked towards the grim-faced crowd and chuckled. "No problem. It's quite simple." Everyone was stunned, even Rock also a little in disbelief and unable to speak for a time. Ezra was not offended by their response. He walked up to him and swiftly marking out several locations on Rock's body. "When you circulate your spiritual energy through these locations, increase the speed by 30% and power by 40%. Rock was taken aback. Although he was utterly confused, he still nodded in the end, still skeptical as he began to circulate his spiritual energy. When it flowed through the locations indicated by the prince, Ezra followed the instructions given, increasing the speed and power. Bzzz. Vicious earth-made shards exploded from Rock's palm as he ferociously chopped downwards. Boom. It was at this moment that Ray and the rest's eyes abruptly widened. The scar left behind by the attack had reached 129 feet. Compared to before, it had grown by a whole 24 feet. A series of gasps were heard as everyone turned towards Ezra in shock. No one had expected a few seemingly casual tips from him to bring about such apparent improvement. Rock was likewise stupefied. It was a long time later before he looked towards Ezra with burning eyes and quivering lips. Even someone as proud as himself could not help but tremble as he said, "Brother Ezra, I'm convinced." The other disciples instantly shifted their practically searing gazes towards Ezra Zephyr. Ray's pretty eyes looked at Ezra as she said in a soft and sweet voice, "Brother Ezra, may I also ask for your guidance in my black shadow art? Brother Ezra, please guide me in my flame thunder force. My thousand-wave scroll." A wave of excited voices exploded by the mountain creek, drowning out the sound of flowing water. With Ezra's terrifying talent and spiritual techniques, the numerous disciples suddenly felt extremely confident in the face of the fast-approaching peak selection ceremony. They would perhaps really end up taking all of the top 10 spots in the peak selection ceremony. The date of the peak selection ceremony grew closer every day. The unofficial outer mountains were bathed in an atmosphere of desperate training, everyone making full use of every second they had in hopes of making themselves just a tiny bit stronger before the arrival of the peak selection ceremony. After all, everyone clearly understood what it represented, their future prospects. They had traveled millions of miles, and crossed uncountable continents just for the chance of entering the Spirit Devouring Mountain. If they were unable to grasp this opportunity to enter the outer mountains, they would surely have to wait a long time for their next chance. Even if they managed to succeed then, they would have already lost the most ideal timing, and those of the same generation would have likely long left them in the dust. Hence, not a single person in the unofficial outer mountains could relax in the face of such an important event. Ezra Zephyr was no exception. By the mountain creek, Ezra Zephyr was seated with his eyes closed as thundering black lightning danced around his body. One would see 3 swirling torrents of spiritual energy in which the barely discernible figures of 3 dragons could be seen. A savage and domineering aura spread from them along with the faint echoes of dragon roars. The 3 torrents of chaotic lightning shuddered, cracks suddenly appearing on the boulder Ezra Zephyr was seated on as muffled explosions rang out in the air. The prince's tightly shut eyes slowly opened, light blossoming within them, before gradually receding. He spat out a breath as faint joy sparkled in his eyes. After half a month of training, he had finally refined the 3 dragon-type martial animal blood, successfully completing 3 of 8 lost dragons. The only thing he needed to do next was to break them in. These 3 of 8 lost dragons possessed overwhelming power. It seems that you've reached the initial level of the 8 lost dragons. While the prince was appreciating his progress, two figures in red and blue flew over, bringing along a slight fragrance. Ravina in Gale and Mahi in Gale stood in front of Ezra with a wide grin. Ezra glanced at her and smiled. The Ryan and Naren disciples have been on pretty bad terms recently, and yet you still come here every day. Over this period of time, she and Mahi did as they wanted, coming to receive guidance from Ezra Zephyr in the Gossamer Steps technique. She was clearly not the least bit affected by the disagreements between the disciples on both sides. Mahi pouted a little. What do such meaningless conflicts have to do with me? She understood that the Shuryen and Ryan disciples believed a little too deeply that they were superior to others, while the non-Shuryen disciples whom were prided geniuses in their respective continents were naturally proud individuals. Contact between the two parties would naturally result in conflict. With regards to such conflicts, she neither had the power to stop them, nor did she want to interfere. Ezra Zephyr said, if everyone was like you too, these troubles would naturally cease to exist. Although both cousins were also proud individuals, she did not bully and humiliate others by relying on her background. Mahi sat down in front of Ezra as she inquired with interest, after the peak selection ceremony, which peak do you want to enter? The prince gazed at the lady back. He did not answer, but asked instead, what about you? Mahi placed a hand on her chin as she answered, of course I want to enter the Colleen Evil Peak. It's the peak with females, and can be said to be one of the most popular peaks amongst the disciples. Ezra asked in surprise, isn't your old ancestor the master of the Heavenly Fiend Peak? Mahi and Gale frowned. The Heavenly Fiend Peak specializes in illusions and mind techniques, and everyone there is covered all over in psychopathic freaks, so depressing. I'll never go to the Heavenly Fiend Peak. Ezra looked at Ravina and asked, what about you? Same answer. He answered. Ezra was somewhat stunned. Martial prowess is akin to a maze, martial masters divided into two categories, martial cultivator and martial sorcerer. And martial prowess is also divided into different types, such as mind techniques, weapon mastery, body strengthening, movement techniques, etc. The fusion of all would allow one to shatter the sky and land with one's bare hands and feet. It was said that at the pinnacle, one's body would achieve the godly level, a realm where a single flick was enough to shatter stars. However, regardless of whether it was cultivation or sorcery, one's prowess first needed to reach a certain level. Ezra curiously asked, what about the other peaks? Mahi laughed and explained, the Blood Slaughterer Peak for example, focuses on using one's spiritual energy to nourish the weapons, such as swords, spears, and rest. It's suitable for those with weapon-based martial spirits. Their attacks are sharp and deadly, with the potential to cut the Milky Way. With regards to sharpness, they are said to be the number one in the Spirit Devouring Mountain. Hence why the Blood Slaughterer Peak is also extremely popular amongst the disciples. Ezra's pupils spun a little. Drake had previously mentioned he had a high-ranking senior in the Blood Slaughterer Peak. Divine Demon Peak is where you will learn about body tampering techniques and external techniques. Bunch of brutes they are, so ugly. Zenith Ghost Peak is famous for creating assassins and spies, due to being expert in movement and survival techniques. Sixth is Arcane Wizardry Peak, current strongest peak. Only martial sorcerers can join this peak and martial cultivators are prohibited to enter the peak. Their peak master despises cultivators for some unknown reason. And last, the weakest one. Alchemic Rune Peak, the only masterless peak. Masterless peak? Ezra was taken aback. Mahi continued. Yes, there was time when this peak was politically strongest and most famous within the sect. However, one day the peak master vanished somewhere and everything after him slowly shattered. Tales told that the Alchemic Rune Peak master was teacher of current supreme leader. He was also extremely powerful. His name etched fear in enemies, his absence played big role in demotion of Spirit Devouring Mountain. Ezra gave a slight nod. He had not expected that there would be such interesting stories behind the 7 peaks. What is the name of that absent master? He asked. Mahi replied with a chubby smile. Master Jason Fellator. Jason Fellator. He mumbled. Ezra Zephyr nodded. Just as he was about to speak, his expression suddenly changed slightly as he lifted his head and looked in a certain direction where a slight disturbance was suddenly felt. Ezra cast his gaze over, only to see the numerous disciples training their retreat like the tide, alarm and fear on their faces. He frowned slightly as he stood up, and saw a young lady in black slowly walked through the now parted mass of disciples. The young lady had beautiful features, and her skin was as white as snow. Her eyebrows, however, gave off a sharp and cold feeling. In her hand was a long sword with a green edge. Ezra's gaze finally came to a stop at her tiny waist, where a golden belt was fastened. Ezra's eyes widened a little. An Outer Mountain golden belt disciple. Mahi and Ravina also caught sight of the young lady at this moment. Mahi's shapely eyebrows immediately bunched together as she slowly muttered, "Why is she here?" "Who is she?" asked the prince. Ravina helplessly shot a look at him and said, "Drake Tubble, a golden belt disciple from the Blood Slaughterer Peak." The prince instantly understood. This must be the elder sister of his clan that Drake had mentioned before. Looks like this guest was not friendly. Sword in hand, the young lady in black slowly walked towards the mountain creek. The numerous disciples would give way one after another wherever she passed, fear and respect in their eyes. They could clearly feel the deadly sword aura emanating from the young lady. Moreover, a golden belt was wrapped around her slender waist, clearly indicating her identity. An Outer Mountain golden belt disciple. One must know that most of the Outer Mountain disciples that came to the Outer Mountains to teach were merely silver belt disciples. With regards to status, they were far from being able to match this young lady in black. However, the girl in black paid no attention to the gazes of the many surrounding disciples. There was only icy haughtiness in her eyes. None of these Outer Mountain disciples were worth even a single glance. She continued to walk, ultimately arriving at Trio's location. Ezra grinned at her. This woman was Drake's elder cousin's sister. Suddenly, coming here at such a time could only mean that she likely did not have any friendly intentions. However, the girl called Denise merely swept a nonchalant glance at him, before looking towards Ravina and Gale. She visibly ignored Mahi as well. Only then did a smile appear on her cold and haughty face. She walked forward and pulled Ravina's hand, smiling as she said, "Ravina, I've been wanting to meet you ever since Drake told me you have also come to the Spirit Devouring Mountain. This is great. When you enter the Outer Mountains, we will be able to meet more often." Ravina felt a little unnatural in response to Denise's enthusiasm. She and the latter were indeed acquainted due to the friendly relations between their two clans, and had spent some time together when they were younger. However, these feelings had dulled during the past few years while Denise was training in the sect. Hence, Ravina was unable to accustom herself to the sudden friendliness. Ravina seamlessly retrieved her hand as she responded, "Senior sister Denise, why have you suddenly come out from the official Outer Mountains?" Denise laughed softly. "Isn't it because I heard that you're here and wanted to see you? I just notified Drake earlier too, the three of us can have a little gathering. I recall you and Drake were pretty close when you were young." Ravina frowned slightly. An intelligent girl like her realized that Denise was not here for Ezra Zephyr, but herself. Her conclusion was spot on. Drake Tubble had indeed come here to create chances for Drake Tubble to better his relation with Ravina and Gale. From what Drake had told her, Ravina seemed to be growing more and more distant towards him, instead becoming chummy with a country bumpkin from this continent. Denise found this rather difficult to accept. The old ancestor of the Ngale clan was the illustrious master of Heavenly Fiend Peak. If Drake and Ravina were to become a couple, it would be greatly beneficial to the Tubble clan. In Drake Tubble's opinion, Drake had outstanding qualities, and was also exceptionally talented, a practically perfect match for Ravina. And yet, some country bumpkin had suddenly emerged out of the blue and ruined this fairy tale, a truly disgusting act. Therefore, she put aside her training, and came over to the Outer Mountains in hopes of finding an opportunity to match-make the two of them. Ravina shook her head, and responded as if she was in a somewhat difficult position, "Senior sister, the peak selection ceremony is just around the corner, and the only thoughts on my mind are to concentrate on my training." Ravina felt an oncoming headache. A woman like this was truly difficult to deal with. She tried to reject, once again. "I'm training the Blazing Pearls technique with Ezra Zephyr, and he only has limited time every day. So I'm really not free." Denise was stunned for a moment. She knew that Mahi was learning gossamer steps from Ezra, but she never thought in her wildest dream that he can teach another difficult techniques that has a different attribute. A sliver of iciness emerged in her eyes as she turned towards the prince and said with a faint smile, "I believe this must be junior brother Ezra Zephyr? I've heard of your recent exploits even in the official Outer Mountains." The werewolf prince did not comment, merely smiling in response. Denise offhandedly said, "How about this, junior brother Ezra? You'll give Ravina some time off today, and make up for it at a later date. How does this sound?" She had a slight smile on her face. Although she seemed to be asking a question, her tone indicated that she had already decided the matter. Ezra's expression remained indifferent. He knew the reason why Ravina lied and went along with it, his eyes lowering slightly as he replied, "The daily training sessions have already been fixed. If she misses it, she'll have to wait for the next one. There are too many disciples learning spiritual techniques here, so we do not do makeup lessons." The smile on Denise's face froze a little. She had originally believed that given her status, a mere unofficial Outer Mountain disciple like him would surely tactfully follow her wishes. After all, this was only a small matter. She never imagined that Ezra would be so ignorant. Junior brother Ezra really has some character. Denise withdrew her smile. She began to observe the prince with indifferent eyes. Drake had naturally mentioned the disagreements between himself and Ezra. However, neither Drake nor Denise felt that it was worth their concern. In her eyes, a second-level core formation Ezra Zephyr was akin to frog in a well. Hence why she had come here purely because of Ravina. She had no intentions whatsoever of doing anything to Ezra. From what she could see, during the peak selection ceremony, this country bumpkin would naturally be crushed under Drake's heels and be thoroughly humiliated. However, she never expected that the country bumpkin would dare to even not give her face. The prince shook his head. "I'm merely following the rules that will be the same regardless of who it is. I hope that senior sister does not blame me." His tone was calm, as if he was being earnest. However, Denise did not think so. She coldly stared at Ezra as the chi-type spiritual energy around her began to tremble, and the faint but extremely sharp cry of a sword rang out. A piercing pressure swept towards Ezra Zephyr. "Senior Denise." Ravina in Gale was the first to speak and immediately took a step forward to stand in front of Ezra. Mahi followed her right after. Her brows knitting together as she said in a somewhat angry voice, "What are you doing?" Denise pursed her lips for a brief moment. She could sense Ravina and Mahi's anger, and immediately withdrew her sword chi as she regretfully said, "Ravina, are you really not going to take this chance to hang out with me?" Ravina curtly replied, "I've been busy with training recently, and really do not want to be distracted." However, she understood that Drake Tubble would not relent so easily, and could only compromise. "If that's really not okay with you, we can find a time to meet up after the peak selection ceremony." Denise was naturally aware that Ravina had finally made a concession. The former immediately grinned and nodded. "All right then, I'll wait till the peak selection ceremony is over. Don't worry, I'll surely be here to attend such a grand occasion." After finishing, she turned around and left. While leaving, her icy gaze seemed to sweep across Ezra Zephyr. Under the attention of numerous gazes, Denise left the mountain creek, eventually arriving at the entrance of the mountain, where she met Drake in his usual white attire. Drake frowned slightly upon seeing that Denise had exited alone. "Is Ravina not coming?" Only then did Denise's pretty face turn stormy, iciness flashing in her eyes as she coldly said, "That little peasant boy is indeed a hateful one." She had clearly placed all of the blame on Ezra Zephyr. "Drake, if you find a chance during the peak selection ceremony, cripple him. I want to let him know that a peasant boy should obediently stay in his little peasant village dump, and stop dreaming of tasting a swan's meat." Her voice was chillingly cold. Drake nodded, an ominous look in his eyes as they swept towards the direction of the mountain creek. Don't worry, I will make him understand that he has offended someone he should never have offended. Time stealthily flowed as the final month gradually reached its end. There was only a single day left before the peak selection ceremony. The atmosphere in the unofficial outer mountains was tense to the limit, numerous disciples everywhere wearing grim expressions, while nervousness hid within the depths of their eyes. Every single one of them understood the importance of tomorrow's peak selection ceremony. A single step to become a dragon, or a single step to become a worm. In these short 3 months after arriving at the Spirit Devouring Mountain, they had deeply experienced how immense of an entity it was, possessing various cultivation resources that their empires or clans could never hope to have. Just the outer mountains alone was already such an eye-opener. What kind of world would they see if they became official outer mountain disciples? It was clear as day to them. Only here could they truly step onto the great path of martial prowess. The imminent peak selection ceremony was the first trial they had to face in the Spirit Devouring Mountain. Only by passing it would they finally ascend the Dragon's Gate. By a certain mountain creek, after the daily session was over, Ezra's gaze swept across the crowd as he said, "Everyone, tomorrow is the day of the peak selection ceremony. Our futures will be decided there and then." Below, XYR, Zulfi Dimitri, Argus Waska, Shifa Pista, their Gale Arms, and other Naren disciples, were there. Behind them were Ash Beckham, Rock, Ray Lime, and the rest of Nanchurien wore solemn expressions. A sliver of respect could be seen in their gazes when they looked towards Ezra Zephyr. For the past month Ezra had indeed fulfilled his promise to them. He had guided them in their spiritual techniques, allowing them to grow substantially stronger. Ray gazed at Ezra and earnestly said, "Brother, we will not let ourselves forget this debt. If there's anything you need in the future, just say the word, and we will do all we can to help." Even the domineering Rock earnestly nodded his head. "I, Rock, rarely acknowledge anyone. Brother Ezra, you're the first. After we enter the outer mountains, I will not give even half an excuse if you ever need my help." The other disciples also said their piece one after another. One could tell that they were indeed grateful towards the prince. After all, if he had not stepped up, they would not have the courage to challenge the Shurian disciples led by Drake. What's more, Ezra had even taken the time to tutor them. He had indeed shown them his sincerity. Ash smiled when he heard this and said, "Brother Ezra's future prospects after entering the outer mountains will surely be limitless, and will soon become one of the pillars that supports the sect. When that happens, you may even find yourself ranked in the rankers list. What help can we possibly offer when that happens?" His provocative words immediately drew a series of laughs and curses from the crowd, making the atmosphere much livelier. The prince chuckled as he waved his hand and said, "I helped you guys for the sake of fighting Drake and the rest during the peak selection ceremony. I can only say that each of us merely fulfilled each other's needs." Ray Lime and gang merely chuckled. Regardless of Ezra's initial goal, at the very least, they had benefited from him, and this was already enough in their eyes. The peak selection ceremony is tomorrow. After training for so long, it's time to relax, go, and take rest," said Ezra, and everyone slowly scattered. The next day, sunlight sprinkled down on the cool morning air, gradually chasing away the darkness that had enveloped the land. After a night of silence, the entire outer mountains seemed to suddenly come awake, bursting with torrents of excitement and anticipation. Like a cold water that was splashed into a deep fryer, noise instantly broke apart the silence. Boiling battle intent filled every inch of the unofficial outer mountains. All because today was the day of the peak selection ceremony. Numerous disciples had come here from various continents to Naren continent. After months of training, they had gradually begun to grow accustomed to life in the Spirit Devouring Mountain, while also sampling the martial prowess resources available here. It was here that they could finally see how grand the road of martial prowess was. As long as they could step onto it, they may have the chance to laugh arrogantly even at the entire world and tower over even the mighty heroes, becoming a true dragon amongst men. However, the peak selection ceremony was currently the biggest obstacle standing in their path. Only by crossing it would they enter the inner mountains, and finally come into contact with the grand road of prowess. Hence, every single disciple had given their all for the past 3 months, investing everything into raising their strength. Everything was for the sole sake of performing well during the peak selection ceremony today, and become the carp that manages to leap through the dragon's gate. As such, when the battle intent that had been brewing for 3 months finally exploded, the spiritual energy in the outer mountains seemed to respond, beginning to heave agitatedly. After 3 entire months of waiting, the peak selection ceremony was finally here. All disciples listen, immediately begin your preparations to follow me to the location of the peak selection ceremony. Amplified by surging spiritual energy, a powerful voice thundered across every corner of the unofficial outer mountains. Countless disciples began to flood out one after another. When they raised their heads and looked, they found Eldarine standing on a strange cloud with 2 elders behind him, their hands behind their backs. One of them was Elder Rustum. Moments after Elder Yin's voice sounded, countless light figures began to shoot out from the outer mountains, an extremely busy sight. Indeed. Ezra and Naren disciples also walked out from a certain location. Ezra gazed upon the practically boiling world around him as he felt the blood within his body begin to burn. He too had been looking forward to the peak selection ceremony ever since 3 months ago. Let's go. He shot a look at his people, before spiritual energy began rising under their feet, carrying the tiny force into the sky. While all of them rose in the air, a cloud of spiritual energy also rose nearby, on which stood Ravina. When she saw Ezra, her gaze went down. Marching towards the ceremony, Ravina soon looked towards Ezra and said, "I'll be looking forward to seeing your abilities today." She said nothing else, and with a tiny stamp of her foot, spiritual energy rose as she headed off first. Ezra watched her fiery red figure leave, before he smirked, "I'm quite a player, it's only been 3 months and someone famous has already become so concerned about me, where is that bluish chubby cheeks?" As the prince was checking surroundings. "Your Majesty!" A voice was suddenly heard from behind at this moment. The prince turned his head, and saw hundreds of figures jumping towards him. It was Naren disciples and others who chose to follow him against Shiryen and Ryan. At this current moment, their expressions were tinged with anticipation while burning battle intent filled their eyes. At the arrival, all Naren disciples knelt before Ezra Zephyr, seeing that some of non-Naren did the same as well. "Let's go, my beloveds," the prince grinned. Without further ado, he waved his long black coat and led the way. Behind him were Xyr, Zulfi, Argus, Shifa, and Ur. The moment they came, Ashbekam and Rest felt a strange powerful aura around them. They grasped that these 6 were stronger than them. Hence, they voluntarily gave them the second leading position. After all, power is what defines your position. Even the normal martial master of Naren was stronger than the rest, but one thing troubled them all. If these Naren disciples had this much power, then why had they never troubled Shiryen and Ryan disciples like they always did? Not long after they left, another group menacingly charged out from the vast sea of people, causing numerous disciples to quickly give way. At their head was naturally the extraordinary Drake Tubbles, dressed in his usual white. Many of the figures behind him belonged to the elites amongst the unofficial outer mountain disciples. When gathered together, their presence was naturally able to sweep everyone else away. However, when the group caught sight of Ezra, their originally domineering presence weakened substantially as they hurriedly avoided his gaze, not daring to even entertain the thought of provoking him. Instead, they cast hostile gazes towards Ashbekam and the rest. They all naturally ignored them, leading his group as they followed far behind Eldarine. The mountain range rapidly fly past below their feet. After some time, Eldarine and the 2 outer mountain elders gradually slowed down. The gazes of Ezra Zephyr and the rest looked to their front, before their expression violently shook. One would see seemingly endless rays of light spreading from the sky high above the numerous majestic peaks. The light seemingly converged into a giant golden pyramid that towered over the land. However, if one were to take a closer look, one would discover many wide and spacious stone platforms within the pyramid of light. There were a total of 10,000 stone platforms. These stone platforms gathered together, forming the shape of a pyramid. The higher up on the pyramid, the wider the stone platforms. At the apex were 9 stone platforms that glowed with a silver radiance, as if they had been made from silver. Above these 9 silver stone platforms was a stone platform that captured everyone's attention, a stone platform that dazzled like gold. It was as clear as day. Only the number 1 individual of the peak selection ceremony would be able to ascend the golden platform. At this moment, Elder Rustum and the other elder suddenly raised their heads, looking towards a certain direction as their voices echoed across the place, "Disciples, get ready to greet the peak masters." Upon hearing this voice, the hearts of every disciple shook, respect rising in their eyes as they looked towards the sky. The hierarchy in Spirit Devouring Mountain was very clear. From lowest to highest it goes. 1. Unofficial Outer Mountains disciples. 2. Official Outer Mountains disciples. 3. Inner Mountains disciples. 4. Ranked disciples. 5. Outer Mountains elders/core disciples. 6. Inner Mountain elders. 7. Peak masters. 8. The chosen 7. 9. Supreme leader. Under the numerous respectful gazes from the disciples, layers upon layers of spiritual energy clouds suddenly appeared far away as a boundless presence unfurled from the horizon. The spiritual energy layers seemed to stir the surrounding space, appearing in the vicinity after several minutes. As the clouds churned, millions and millions of light rays seemed to shine across the land. The disciples looked towards the clouds, finding 7 figures seated within. Even space itself seemed tremble under their gazes as they sat there like gods, possessing power that could shake the land. Ezra's heart shuddered as he gazed upon the 7 imposing figures. Although he had seen Ayrton Magnus before, but Letter hid his strength before Ezra. The 7 figures before his eyes, however, truly gave off an aura of terrifying power. Such power seemed to be capable of bringing about a Murgadon. This the strength of the peak masters. Clouds churned as they swept across the area. Every unofficial Outer Mountain disciple lifted their heads, reverence in their eyes as they looked towards the spiritual energy clouds. At the center, spiritual energy took the shape of a tree. 7 figures sat on 7 branches. The figure on first branch wore azure robes, and looked like a middle-aged man. However, his hair was entirely white, while his eyes seemed to contain an immeasurable depth as if it was the starry sky, giving off an unfathomable feeling. An indescribable presence spread from his body, like the deepest pool, like the highest peak, making solemn respect involuntarily rise within anyone who felt it. All he did was smile slightly as he sat on the first branch, while the entire world around him seemed to shiver slightly along with his breathing. Even though he had already retrained the majority of his presence, the tiny slivers that spread from him still made the numerous unofficial Outer Mountain disciples feel a boundless pressure. It was as if they were standing before a god that could not be defied. This person was the master of the arcane wizardry peak, Master Antero. This person was the master of the arcane wizardry peak, Master Antero. The prince sighed in amazement at arcane wizardry peak master's presence, before turning his gaze towards the other branch. As Ezra Zephyr focused, the person to enter his eyes was the tall and slender figure of a gorgeous woman. She was dressed in aureate-decorated palace garbs, which accentuated her fine curves. Her facial features were also extremely pretty, her fine black hair pulled backwards, giving her a mature and graceful aura. It was an aura that even a perfect beauty like Fairy Hololeth did not possess, because it required the accumulation of experience over the years. Gil Subzi saw the glitters in Ezra's eyes and secretly said, "Hee, your majesty, that should be the master of Colleen Evil Peak, Bisma Vermidov, people call her Ice Beauty. I've heard that when she was younger, she was a famous great beauty of Spirit Devouring Mountain. From what I can see, she does live up to her reputation. Colleen Evil Peak is also one of the most popular choices in the Spirit Devouring Mountain. Their disciples are all females and heart-stirringly beautiful. With regards to appearance, they are definitely the best in the Spirit Devouring Mountain." Gil Subzi was practically drooling at this point. Soon after, he regretfully said, "However, it's unfortunate that I won't be able to enter. Why would someone wise plant rafflesia in a rose garden? Ezra Zephyr chuckled. Gil Subzi touched his fat face, before turning his gaze towards the third branch. The one next to Peak Master Bisma was an elderly white-haired figure. The old man had a pair of white eyebrows that connected in the center, making the expression on his aged face seem somewhat miserable. Aura rose around the white-brow elder, seemingly forming millions of ancient and profound illusions. Every gaze would make the heart of anyone who saw it beat a little faster and brain dizzy. If I'm not wrong, he should be the master of Heavenly Fiend Peak, old ancestor of Ravina and Mahi, Aksama in Gale. No wonder they disliked Heavenly Fiend Peak, one look at him and even I got a shallow migraine, said Ezra in a low voice. If one were to talk about illusions and mind control, this white-brow elder was likely number one in the entire Spirit Devouring Mountain. Atop of fourth branch was a metal tower-like figure, an elder that was bare all the way down to the waist. However, the elder's body was not hunched over like an old man's. A dark gold luster shined on his skin, light seemingly swirling on it as if it was made from gold. Faint, mysterious patterns could be seen on the surface of his body. He was also imposingly muscular, practically overshadowing the white-brow elder on the other branch. As he crossed his arms across his chest and breathed, the spiritual energy and blood in his body seemed to circulate like an unstoppable flood, while rumbling thunder was continuously emitted, pulsing with terrifying power. If he had not painstakingly restrained it, just the rumbling from the spiritual energy in his body would likely kill all the core formation stage disciple present. This elder had a different aura. From the white-brow elder, an aura of unmatched ferocity, as if he was a giant that had walked out from the prehistoric era. Ezra Zephyr wiped away the cold sweat on his brows. This individual was the master of Divine Demon Peak, Master Franco. On the fifth branch was a figure wearing a set of simple hemp garments. At closer inspection, one would see a kindly expression on his young and handsome face, his skin glowing like jade. A mottled stone sword lay across his knees, giving off a faint but terrifying aura. The spiritual energy around him faintly vibrated as the cry of a sword rang out from within, as if a sea of swords were hidden around him. All Ezra Zephyr did was look at the handsome youth for a while, when he felt a piercing pain in his eyes, causing him to hurriedly withdraw his gaze. This person should be the master of Blood Slaughterer Peak. Master Terror. Yes, your majesty. But I heard he kept his youth due to his martial prowess. His body contained several scars, which he has veiled with his spiritual energy. Gil Subzi informed as he tightly shut his eyes from pain. Ezra rubbed his eyes and looked towards the sixth branch, only to see that sky in the area was dark, lightning flashing in the clouds as if a lightning dragon was flying within. On the sixth branch was an elder in black robes, with an impassive face. Lightning swam in his eyes as a frightening pressure slowly spread, shaking the space around him. Ezra Zephyr could sense astonishing power in the black-robed elder's body, that seemed to briefly reveal itself before vanishing the next moment. The master of Zenith Ghost Peak is definitely terrifying. Ezra Zephyr's expression had turned grim. The master of Zenith Ghost Peak is known for lightning speed. His name was Master Albus. In the last seventh branch sat a young man. He looked gloomy and tensed. Unlike the rest, he lacked the power and aura, seemingly the weakest one. The whereabouts of the master of Alchemic Rune Peak is unknown. This must be a high-ranking disciple or elder of Alchemic Rune Peak, said Gil Subzi. Hugh. Ezra breathed in deeply, gradually controlling the emotions in his heart. These 7 figures before his eyes, especially the first 6, were hegemons of the Spirit Devouring Mountain. Each one wielded immeasurable power. It was no wonder that the Spirit Devouring Mountain had been able to remain amongst the top 7 first-degree sects for all these years. With such power, they still declined and lost the rank of first-degree sects. Just how powerful the current top 7 sects are? Ezra pondered. Behind the spiritual energy tree were numerous figures that gave off powerful presences, evidently the powerful experts of the Spirit Devouring Mountain. It seems that the internal department of the sect also viewed this event with extreme importance. On the first branch, Master Antero cast his gaze downwards. It was as if nothing could hide from his gaze as it shined upon every disciple. A single glance from him was seemingly capable of piercing even the netherworld, allowing him to clearly view every aspect of every individual. Ezra Zephyr seemed to feel Master Antero's gaze pause just a little when it swept across him, before continuing on its path. At the same time, Master Antero's grand and loud voice boomed across the area from high above like rumbling thunder. The Spirit Devouring Mountain is recruiting 10,000 disciples this time. A single person per platform. I hope all the disciples will give their all. Higher the platform, higher the standing insect. From this point, the official and unofficial Outer Mountain title is abolished. Either you will be an Outer Mountain disciple or you will go back to your home. The top 10 will directly become Outer Mountain Gold Belt disciples, while the champion will be bestowed a Gamma Layer skill or a similarly powerful spell and chance to use Divine Spirit Ablution. These words immediately caused the numerous unofficial Outer Mountain disciples below to burst into a frenzy, gaze after gaze beginning to burn as they overflowed with battle intent. Master Antero smiled slightly at this sight before his powerful voice thundered again. Disciples, let the peak selection ceremony begin. The instant Master Antero's words left his mouth, boiling battle intent exploded from the countless unofficial Outer Mountain disciples as burning gaze after gaze looked towards the pyramid made from 10,000 stone platforms. These platforms represented the number of people that could become Outer Mountain disciples, meaning there were only 10,000 spots. In comparison, there were several tens of thousands of unofficial Outer Mountain disciples. In other words, the majority would ultimately be eliminated. It was definitely going to be a highly intense struggle. To occupy a platform and take a spot for yourself, you would need to experience difficult battle after battle. Only then would the other competitors be too intimidated to challenge you. The gazes of countless disciples met, sparks flying. Spiritual energy suddenly erupted. It was as if a fuse was lit, tearing apart the deadlock as countless disciples began to shoot forward a split second later. They swarmed into the sky like locusts, flying towards the many stone platforms floating in the air. It was indeed a spectacular sight. Go. Today will be the day we show our might. Drake let out an icy laugh as his cold gaze swept towards the nearby Ezra. With a wave of his sleeve, vigorous spiritual energy erupted, and Drake took the lead to dash into the sky. Behind him, Paul Channa, Toria, and other powerful Shurien and Ryan disciples also shot forth, closely following behind. Their menacing aura made it such that no one dared to obstruct them. All non-Naren disciples, go. Ezra ordered. Ash Beckham and Rock flinched. Brother Ezra, all non-Naren? What about you guys? Rock asked. Believe in me, every one of you who chose to follow me today will have a platform, it's certain. Hearing the bold claim, the duo exchanged gazes and shot forward, leading the geniuses that they gathered. Ray Lime looked at Ezra with a smile. Brother Ezra, I believe you, don't betray us, it's a request. She said before marching ahead. The prince nodded, and he looked at the leaving masses. Ezra and his Naren subordinates calmly stood still and watched the disciples marching forward. This action was seen by many, including those on the spiritual energy tree branches. What is he doing? Master Franco of Divine Demon Peak asked. Antero smiled. That is something I am curious about as well. He should be punished for such ignorance, said Master Bisma of Colleen Evil Peak. At this point, the quiet old man spoke. Don't vent your anger on him just because he is a handsome boy, not a handsome girl. He was none other than Master Aksama of Heavenly Fiend Peak. Bisma sent a glare at him but remained silent. Aksama continued. I see tremendous potential in that youth, let him do what he wants, there is no rule that forces disciples to occupy platform faster. Time is not limited here. He looked at Bisma. It's another case if you have to take your beauty-preserving pills, only then your logicless impatience will be deemed as logical. Bisma's face turned grave, she looked at the master of arcane wizardry Peak and said, Antero, keep his mouth shut. Aksama, do you want me to report Supreme Leader? Antero uttered in a warning. Aksama Ingale smiled and shook his head before turning his gaze again to the disciples. Ezra Zephyr took in a deep breath as he gazed upon the sky full of glowing figures, burning battle intent rising from the depths of his eyes. XYR, Zulfi Dimitri, Argus Waska, Shifa Pista, their Gale Arms, and the rest quietly stood behind them. After 3 months of bitter training, it was finally time for them to show their worth. I want one thing from all of you: I spend my resources and time to nurture you. If anyone fails my expectation, then it would be better for him to commit suicide. Because what I'll do to him would be torturous and more terrible than death. Many of the disciples unwillingly gulped and the rest licked their lips, which dried from excitement. If your enemy shows a special tier weapon, then show yours as well. If not, then keep it under your sleeve. Even this humongous sect will be suspicious to see that number of special tier weapons. All of you, help those who followed us, and then claim the highest platforms for yourself. Kill all Shurian and Ryan disciples at sight, with the exception of Ingale sisters. With that said, the werewolf prince of Bloodfang Kingdom moved. Black lightning danced around his feet as he jolted forward. Let's go. It seemed as if they were waiting for this. With a surge of spiritual energy, their figures also shot forth, the dozen gathered figures also pretty eye-catching. In a short span of a minute, numerous figures landed on the lowest stone platforms. However, with the exception of a tiny handful, most did not linger for even a second, instead using the platform as a foothold to propel their bodies forward again, heading towards the higher platforms. Everyone knew that the higher the platform, the better one would be able to show one's abilities. The rankings would also be different, enabling one to receive better treatment in the future. Hence, everyone wanted to climb as high as they could instead of dwelling at the bottom of the pyramid. Of course, not everyone had the courage. Disciples that were satisfied as long as they could become outer mountain disciples stayed behind, standing at the center of the stone platforms, indicating their determination to vie for it. Anyone that was also interested in competing would step onto the same stone platform and begin the fight to decide who would ultimately have the right to occupy it. Hence, in a short few minutes, bouts of berserk spiritual energies were already exploding on many stone platforms. The figures within engaged in battle. The world around them was filled by the sounds of clashing. On the spiritual energy tree and high above, numerous gazes were cast down, watching the clashes on the stone platforms. Master Antero gazed at the 6 individuals around him as he smiled and said, "I wonder who will end up as the champion." On the 5th branch, the youthful-looking blood slaughterer Peak Master, Terror, whose face gave off a healthy jade-like glow, let out a gentle chuckle as he said, "I've heard that the Tubble clan's Drake Tubble has been recognized as the head of the 10 great outer mountain disciples. If nothing unexpected happens, he should be the greatest contender for first place." On 2nd branch, Colleen Evil Peak's master, Bisma Vermidov's long and narrow phoenix eyes swept over as she said with an implicative tone, "I've heard Drake Tubble has already received much attention from Peak Master Terror. I believe he will likely join the Blood Slaughterer Peak after the ceremony, right? The Blood Slaughterer Peak has managed to snatch quite several excellent seedlings over the years." Terror smiled slightly. "My Blood Slaughterer Peak has relatively weaker foundations after all, giving me no choice but to recruit more disciples. We're still far from being able to match you all, that's why I am sitting on the 5th branch." Antero smiled and said, "The Blood Slaughterer Peak's current accomplishments cannot be separated from Peak Master Terror's efforts. The Spirit Devouring Mountain is where I was born after all. I naturally want to do my part," said Peak Master Terror with a smile. Upon hearing these words, Peak Master Antero continued to smile faintly, while Bisma Vermidov's eyes narrowed slightly without anyone's notice. At this moment, a figure suddenly stepped forward from behind the tree and respectfully reported, "Peak Master, though Drake's chances are indeed great, there is someone that should be able to compete with him." If one looked over, one would discover that the person who had spoken was the one who had brought Ezra to the Spirit Devouring Mountain, Zephyr. "Oh?" Peak Master Antero chuckled upon hearing this. "Is it the one from the Heavenly Fiend Master's clan?" Upon hearing Peak Master Antero's words, the Heavenly Fiend Peak Master, Aksama Ingale's lips cracked open as he laughed, before he said in a booming voice, "Those little lasses are quite talented, but they are still lacking a little compared to Drake. If they fought, their chances at winning will not be high." Xavier also chuckled and said, "Ravina does have astonishing talent. If given more time, no one would be her match in the peak selection ceremony. However, the one I'm referring to is not her, but another fellow called Ezra Zephyr." He pointed towards a certain spot below as the hegemon's gazes followed. They saw Ezra leading a group of disciples as they climbed to higher platforms. "Oh, that mysterious one," mumbled Antero. A distance ahead was Drake Tubble's and gang of Shurian disciples. One look was all it took. Anyone could see that these two groups were the elites amongst this batch of Outer Mountain disciples. Going forward without stopping a bit. This one only has the strength of the second-level core formation stage. How did he make so many people submit to him? Colleen Evil Peak Master Bisma's tone was one of interest. His body is not weak and have reached an astonishing stage. No wonder. However, she soon sensed the abnormally strong body of the prince. The white-brow elder also looked down, a trace of interest appearing on his seemingly miserable-looking face. "I told you before, he has something special. His perception is not bad, he should be pretty decent in illusion spiritual techniques." Xavier said, "Ezra comes from this Naren continent, where he distinguished himself in the spirity bailiwick and obtained the greatest gifts." These words immediately caused the eyes of the 7 hegemons to widen a little. Soon after, all of them fell silent. Master Antero slowly said, "There has been a Kabbalistic and deep connection of spirity bailiwick and our Spirit Devouring Mountain. I heard Supreme Leader talk about it. However, for many past years, distinguished disciples of spirity bailiwick chose to join other sects. For the first time, we will witness the chronicles of someone who ranked first in spirity bailiwick." The Heavenly Fiend Master Uxama Ingale's eyebrows raised as he pondered something. His expression was mystic as an old voice filled with curiosity sounded, "I always wonder, just what is spirity bailiwick?" The muscular one on Fourth Branch sighed. "I am seeing hope for the upcoming war against those Duel Mountain mongrels." The atmosphere turned grave. They knew that their demotion from first-degree sect to second-degree sect occurred due to new existence of Duel Mountain Peak. The newly Duel Mountain Peak was steadily rising in power, and there was also the powerful Holy Law sect behind them. Hence, even the Spirit Devouring Mountain could only bury their hatred deep in their hearts. In the sky, a tree made of spiritual energy floated. Hearing the words of Master Franco, the air around Master Bisma and Master Uxama also turned much colder. In the end, Master Antero waved his hand and said in a low voice, "Think about the big picture." "Humph." Fury flashed in the eyes of Bisma as she let out an icy snort. She looked as if she wanted to say something, but ultimately resisted the urge. However, her soul-stirringly beautiful face was clearly covered in frost. The white-brow elder lowered his gaze and remained silent. The Blood Slaughterer Peak Master Terror sighed softly. The Alchemic Rune Peak Representator remained expressionless. Antero chuckled, consoling everyone 2 more times, before casting his gaze to the numerous stone platforms below. Amongst the innumerable figures, Ezra Zephyr and hundreds he led rapidly ascended the pyramid. Master Antero concentrated on the youthful figure as he said in a soft voice, "Let us see whether this young one will be able to give us a pleasant surprise." 10,000 stone platforms were gathered in the shape of a pyramid as they floated in the sky, dazzling brilliantly when the rays of the sun shined upon them. Boom boom. At this current moment, berserk mana and chi violently pulsed from numerous platforms. One would see a swarm of glowing figures continuously leaping upwards, jumping from platform to platform as they climbed. There was pretty much no other rules for this peak selection ceremony. At the center of each stone platform was a mat. As long as someone could sit on it without being disturbed for an hour of time, the stone platform would close, restricting anyone else from entering. When this happened, it would mean that the platform had been occupied. Any means could be used to achieve this, including killing. Therefore, when someone powerful appeared on a stone platform, others might gang up on this individual, making the situation extremely chaotic. Swish swish. The prince and the rest stuck close together as stone platform after stone platform rapidly passed by under their feet, their figures never lingering even for a second. There was slightly less than 500 people in their group, each an elite amongst the unofficial Outer Mountain disciples. Hence, their goal was the top 500 in the peak selection ceremony, and this place was clearly not their final destination. A short distance to their front on the right was another group leaping past platform after platform. They were the Shurien disciples led by Drake Tubble. The gazes on both sides clashed from time to time, sparks flying. The numbers of these two parties were special when taking into account all the Outer Mountain factions. They were two most unified groups, hence why their every action seemed exceptionally attention-grabbing. The other disciples on the stone platforms gave way one after another, not daring to compete with these two groups. Soon, Ash Beckham, Rock, Ray Lime and others joined them as well. Reaching 600 in numbers, it was that time when Ash and Rest realized the monstrous power and numbers of Naren disciples. As time passed in this manner, the two groups of disciples rapidly passed by numerous platforms and began to gradually approach the upper area of the pyramid. This was where the top 600 stone platforms lay. The disciples that were confident enough to come here were all powerful in their own right. Thus, the battles between them grew increasingly intense. By this point, individuals from the two groups finally began to break off and select their stone platforms, not advancing any further. Of course, besides the two factions led by Ezra Zephyr and Drake Tubble, there were also many other disciples vying for these stone platforms, which consisted of both non-Shurien and Shurien disciples. After all, not every outstanding disciple had been recruited by Ezra and Drake. Even more had chosen to remain neutral, declining to be part of the grudge between the two parties. Only Naren continent remained unified. However, they were currently faced with the situation of limited platforms. Hence, they no longer cared which party anyone belonged to, directly engaging any competitor they met in combat. Drake was at the very front, his icy gaze occasionally sweeping towards Ezra, who was just a short distance behind. He had originally planned to recruit elite Shurien disciples and forcibly occupy the top 10 spots. If Ezra dared to contest, the group would gang up on him and chase him off. If that were the case, Ezra would not even have the chance to duke it out with Drake Tubble. However, Drake had not expected that Ezra would also have a group of elite disciples, even better than his. Together, they were an extremely strong force, making it impossible for his initial plan to work. Since that is so, I will personally stomp you into the ground. Drake's eyes were filled with ridicule. As long as Ravina Ingale did not interfere, he would let Ezra understand the gap between them. He wanted the prince of a remote kingdom to know that a peasant like him should have obediently stayed in his shitty peasant kingdom. How could a peasant like him have designs on a girl blessed by the heavens like Ravina Ingale? Drake raised his head as the topmost area of the pyramid came into view. 1 golden and 9 silver stone platforms glittered under the sun. These were the top 10 spots. By this time, there were only 9 figures remaining behind him. However, powerful spiritual energy undulations spread from all of them, clearly showing that each one was a formidable individual qualified to compete for the top 10. Their eyes gradually began to burn with excitement, clearly understanding that the true battle was finally about to begin. Drake took in a deep breath and looked at his followers. In the next instant, a shout akin to thunder boomed, "Do it!" The instant Drake shouted, ominous glints flashed in the eyes of Toria and the rest as waves of berserk spiritual energy violently swept unfurled, transforming into streams that bombarded Ezra's group. Several torrents of spiritual energy whizzed towards them. The prince's gaze flickered faintly, but no change could be seen on his face, evidently having already anticipated this. He extended a hand and gave a slight wave. Behind him, Ash Beckham, Rock and Ray Lime also acted together as spiritual energy flooded the sky, directly clashing against the other side's attacks. Berserk spiritual energy shockwaves unfurled like a storm. It was extremely chaotic. Toria and the rest sternly shouted, "Ezra, if you want to pass, you'll have to defeat us first. Haha, Toria, the likes of you does not have the qualifications to obstruct Brother Ezra. I'll be the one to play with you. The moment Toria's voice was heard, Rock shot forward, howling with laughter. You're going to stop me? Ridicule appeared on Toria's face. Rock did not respond, his figure flashing as it appeared in front of Toria. Spiritual energy rapidly swirled around the former's growing hands along with deadly land vandal hand. Rock sent a chop flying, deadly dipper winds violently slashing downwards. The two clashed directly, the air under their hands rapidly torn to pieces. A shockwave unfurled as both figures landed on tense stone platform and stumbled several steps back. Toria's originally mocking expression had turned much uglier as he grimly said, "Why has your land vandal hand also reached the second level?" One must know that his progress in the land vandal hand was attributed to the personal tutor invited by Drake and numerous cultivation resources. Only through these did he manage to reach the second level. From what he knew, Rock's land vandal hand had fallen behind substantially, making it practically impossible for him to catch up. But the power of the vandal earth from Rock's previous palm strike had clearly reached the second level of the land vandal hand. Rock licked his lips, the vandal earth attribute around his hands tightly clenched into fists, madly devastating the surroundings with astonishing destructive force. He grinned widely and said, "It's all thanks to you guys. If you guys had not decided to deal with Brother Ezra, he would not have given us guidance in our spiritual techniques." Toria's eyes filled with wavering uncertainty. He had indeed heard that Ezra was giving pointers to Rock and the rest, but had not thought much of it. After all, none of them would believe that Ezra could possibly be so capable in techniques other than gossamer steps. But the undeniable fact before him was that Rock's land vandal hand was indeed not inferior to his own. A hint of regret raised deep in his heart, but he had come far ahead now. Toria frostily declared, "What's there to be happy about? Brother Drake will teach Ezra who will be the true champion of the peak selection ceremony. You peasants are delusional to think that you can challenge the status of us Shurian disciples. We'll know who's right after we fight." Rock let out an icy laugh. Without further ado, his foot slammed into the ground, rocketing his body forward. "Come to your death, peasant." Toria laughed in anger. The spiritual energy inside his body burst out without reservation as he met Rock's charge head-on. Deadly earth attribute shards devastated the surroundings, leaving scar after scar on the stone platform. On the 9th platform, Ash Beckham stood against an independent Ryan disciple. "I'm not part of Drake's group, however, I will not surrender to you," said a young man in decent clothes. Ash Beckham smiled. "No worries, let's have a fair fight." Hearing that, the individual smiled back and bowed a little to show friendly gesture. "Thank you, let's start." On 8th stone platform, Ray Lime stood in front of Usopp. Usopp said with his arms across his chest, "Sister Ray, your black shadow art is countered by my sunlight law. I advise you to leave while you can." Ray Lime softly chuckled upon hearing this. "There's a mistake in Brother Usopp's words. The counter you speak of also holds true if reversed. As long as my black shadow art is more practiced than your sunlight law, you will be the one to be countered instead." Mockery rose from the corners of Usopp's lips. "I've received guidance day and night for the past month, and my sunlight law has already reached the initial stage. In terms of mastery, you are far from my match." As he spoke, sunlight chi began to rise from his body as a dreadful heat slowly spread, charring the ground around him. However, Ray merely smiled faintly in response to the domineering heat. Spiritual energy surged in her body as frighteningly cold black chi suddenly pulsed, instantly freezing the ground below her feet. Cold air rose, completely blocking Usopp's sunlight. "Brother Usopp is too complacent. My black shadow art has also advanced to the next level under Brother Ezra's guidance during the past month." She suddenly laughed charmingly. "To be honest, I should be thanking you guys." Ray's expression turned somewhat ugly at the sight of the alarming black spiritual energy spreading from Ray's body. Soon after, he inhaled deeply and said, "Ezra, why did he come in my generation?" His gaze turned grim again as he said, However, things won't go as he wants this time. You guys may be able to stop us, but don't forget that Paul Channa is only slightly weaker than Brother Drake, and there's no one on your side who can stop him. Ray frowned slightly. Paul was ranked third amongst the 10 great Outer Mountain disciples. Although he did not flaunt his abilities, he was definitely the strongest person on Drake's side. She looked towards a stone platform in the distance. Ever since arriving at the top 10 platforms, Mahi and Gale had leisurely occupied 7th platform and nobody dared to disturb her because of her background. Besides a few bold disciples who tried to charge in and were insta-killed at the beginning, there was basically no one who dared to approach her platform. After occupying it, Mahi and Gale sat there with a smile, looking at Ezra. Ray Lime let out a bitter chuckle, before she lifted her head slightly to look above where 12 figures were leaping into the air. Ezra signaled there and he jumped at the 6th platform. Another girl jumped along with him. An independent Shurian disciple who ranked 9th in top 10 unofficial Outer Mountain disciples. The high rankers were busy fighting lower platforms, so she quietly aimed for a higher one. Seeing their Galarm, she said nothing and took out her daggers. In response, their Galarms also showed his 2 shamshirs. After their, Argus Waska claimed the 5th platform. However, the moment he landed, he heard a loud noise. Bam! He looked and found that a giant man landed on the same 5th platform. He was behemoth-sized, almost 2 times bigger than Argus Waska. He was an independent Nonchurian disciple who was famous for his brute strength. On the 4th platform arrived Shifa Pista and Natli Tum, a rank 5th disciple who used to hang out with Ravina and Mahi. Shifa looked murderous with her heavy armor on. She took out the labries of hers and prepared to attack. "Hey, wait," said Natli. She charmingly laughed and continued, "I don't want to fight, I am a friend of Ravina and Mahi. How about we bet? If Ezra wins against Drake, the platform will be yours, and if Drake wins, the platform will be mine. What do you say, sounds fun?" Shifa Pista remained silent, on which Natli cunningly incited. "What? You don't trust your prince?" "Haha." Shifa laughed. "I was just surprised why you want to lose this platform without a fight." Natli's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Shifa calmly said as he looked at the top golden platform. "Drake's defeat is set in stone, the question should be, how much torture our prince will inflict upon him." He looked at Natli again. "I accept your bet." Only 6 remained who continuously jumped on the pyramid. Drake Tubble, Paul Channa, Ravina and Gale. These 3 were ahead and the 3 behind were Ezra Zephyr, XYR and Zulfi Dimitri. Ravina and Gale dashed and reached the 2nd platform. It seems that she was not interested in the 1st position at all. Without her, Drake and Paul infused their spiritual energy and bolted ahead until their feet touched the golden platform. Drake cast a mocking glance at Ezra, as he nonchalantly remarked, "It seems that you did recruit enough people." The prince stood on the 3rd silver stone platform. Black lightning flickered under his feet. He was currently looking to the top with an expressionless face. Near the top golden platform stood Drake and Paul with their hands behind their backs. 2 powerful presences, like 2 towering mountains, blocked the path towards the final golden stone platform. Like 2 tigers blocking the road. Drake's indifferent gaze looked towards Ezra as he said, "Ezra, this is where you stop." He did not speak any further, his gaze turning towards Paul. "Brother Paul, I'll be handing him to you. Delay him for an hour of time, and we'll be able to occupy the champion's platform." Paul smiled slightly and replied, "Sure, but you must fulfill the promise you made." Paul Channa was just that tiny bit weaker than Drake, and came from the prominent Channa clan. Hence, he was naturally not subordinate to Drake, but rather friends of sorts. Since Drake had asked him to take on this task, the latter would naturally have to pay a certain price. "Don't worry." Drake nodded before his cold gaze turned towards Ezra, mockery lifting from the corners of his mouth. "Brother Paul will play with you for a bit. I've told you before that you shouldn't dream of taking 1st place." "Hey, pretty guy." Ezra called out to Paul. Why don't you fight one of these guys, and let me disfigure that shithead's mug? He said as he pointed his thumb backwards, to where Zulfi and XYR were. They are pretty strong, maybe stronger than Drake. Hearing these words, Paul frowned a bit before regaining his calm smile. Brother Ezra, why clench the first rank when you enjoy one of the top 10? Ezra sighed. It seems you don't understand words. The prince raised his hand. Paul flinched, but he didn't see anything coming out of Ezra's side. Chain of chaos. As Ezra uttered that, a small portal appeared behind the left leg of Paul. A chain made of black and red lightning zipped out. Before Paul could move, the chain grabbed his leg. It was the second circle spell that he made himself. His control over the chains evolved into phenomenal. The chain grabbed the leg of Paul Channa. He cried in shock. What is this? The prince moved his hand and the chain moved. The body of Paul Channa was swinging in midair before the chain threw him towards the third platform. Bomb. He landed on the third platform, where Ezra, Zulfi, and XYR stood. You should have come here when I respectfully asked, said Ezra as the black lightning danced under his feet. Paul Channa was bewildered. He couldn't understand what happened. The prince was about to jump when he pondered something. He looked towards the duo and asked, which one of you will fight him? This question raised the heartbeat of the duo. Obviously him, master, said XYR. Hearing that, Zulfi Dmitri retorted. I have a different opinion. You should stay here and secure this platform and I will follow His Majesty. Why did you think that? XYR's expression turned grave. Zulfi expressionlessly replied. Because I am stronger than you. The one who will go above means that he is stronger than the one below. Despite the unity of Naren disciples, there has been a huge and famous rivalry going on between Zulfi Dmitri, the old leader, and XYR, the new powerhouse. Other than Master Ezra, no one here is capable of defeating me, XYR boldly claimed. Zulfi smiled. It's because we have been on the same side. Ever felt a sharp sword on your neck? I'll prefer a scythe, XYR retorted. Ezra, who was listening to them, finally lost his patience. Oi, both of you knuckleheads. I don't have time. Toss a coin. Yes, master. As you wish, your majesty. Both of them quickly obeyed and Zulfi took out the coin. They quickly tossed it into the air. Tin tin tin. The coin fell, and the one who lost the bet was Zulfi Dmitri. With that decided, Ezra jumped upwards and XYR was about to follow him when he heard. Jinn of cult, never ever believe that I, Zulfi Dmitri, am weaker than you, he said and turned towards Paul Channa. On the second platform. XYR gave him a final look and jumped above. Paul Channa saw a man with a long sword on his waist coming towards him in armor. He spoke. What's your name? I haven't seen you be dash. Please, be quiet and fight, I am already in a bad mood. Before Paul could ask his question, Zulfi declared his side of the words. On the way towards the top platform, when Ezra and XYR reached the second platform. Ezra signaled XYR to not land on second platform and keep going upward. Zapapak. A strange sound resounded that forcefully brought XYR onto the second platform. Countless gazes looked over, only to find a fiery red figure proudly standing on the edge of second platform, a red whip wrapped around its wrist like a circle of fire. It was obviously Ravina Ingale. Hey, did you guys forget about me? Ravina Ingale smiled in annoyance. XYR was taken aback, evidently not expecting Ravina to suddenly hit an ally. Given the latter's ability, no one else would dare to snatch any of the top 10 spots she occupied. Ravina. At this moment, the expression of Ezra, who had originally been heading towards the tallest golden stone platform, turned serious when he saw this, and angrily said, Ravina, I was letting you have this platform, what the hell do you think you are doing? Ravina shot a smile at him and retorted, in my eyes, there is no difference between friends and foes during a competition. I do not want a seat that I don't deserve. Leave this one here, I will consider him as my opponent. Don't worry, I won't hurt him bad. Ezra shook his head and said. I am not worried about that straw hat, I am worried about you, Missy. He is stronger than you, you should accept our kindness. These words hit proud Ravenna as arrows. How dare you belittle me? This stupid-looking man is stronger than me? Your words have made me angry, Ezra. I will vent my anger on your subordinate. Ezra sighed. Women are sure dogged creatures. Ravenna ignored him, her bright eyes turning towards XYR as she said, Go, and fight for first place, I'll test your so-called stronger-than-me subordinate. XYR, who was silent, finally opened his mouth. Red girl, you have made a terrible mistake. The killing intent he released shocked Ravenna in gale, her pulse beat faster. What is this? XYR, if you kill her, I'll kill you. Ezra said before he set his eyes on the golden platform. Yes, master. XYR calmly replied. With a deep breath, Ezra's foot suddenly pushed downwards. Black and red chaos lightning danced around his body, transforming him into a flash of black and red that dashed towards the sky. Ravenna for the first time was awed by Ezra Zephyr. Who exactly is he to command such a terrifying bunch of people? In a few dozen minutes, he stood at the same height as Drake Tubble. Drake's handsome face was currently ominously stormy. He stared at the prince for a long time, before gradually suppressing the churning rage in his heart. Drake frostily remarked, You really are like a lingering ghost. The prince grinned, before lifting his head to look towards the golden stone platform. If not because you provoked me time and time again, I would not have had much interest in the first place, and have remained a low profile. It was indeed as he had said. His original goal had been top 10, so that he would qualify for the right to choose his peak. As for number 1, he never really gave it much thought, because it would reveal his potential. But who would have expected the petty and narrow-minded Drake to repeatedly target him? One more thing that pushed Ezra to aim for the first rank is the reward, the divine spirit ablution. He also figured out that the disciple and elders here believe in the concept of might is right, so Drake's provocation was a blessing in disguise. Drake's expression had already fully returned to normal. He stared at Ezra, a faint trace of disdain hanging from the corners of his mouth as he uncaringly said, Are you saying this to make me feel regretful? Peasant wolf, you overestimate yourself. Do you truly believe that you are any threat to me? In my eyes, you're just a dirty and disgusting mud mutt. All you are is an eyesore, but since you've now truly angered me, I can only stomp you to death. A chilling light flitted across Drake's eyes. You're such an ignorant fool that does not know the immensity of the realms. I will beat you till you wake up from your delusions, and let you know that compared to Shurian geniuses like us, you're ultimately just a peasant that has never seen the world. When the final word left his mouth, powerful spiritual energy exploded from Drake's body like a storm. The spiritual energy carried him straight into the sky, before landing him on the golden stone platform. At the same time, Drake's intensely chilling shout sounded across the area. Ezra Zephyr, get your ass up here. I will make sure that you will no longer dare to appear before me ever again. Ezra Zephyr in return was laughing. Unusual to his evil smirk, he was laughing quite loudly as if he heard a good joke or expecting a nice comedy show. A split second later, black and red bolts of lightning formed wings behind his back and shot forth. Swish. His figure also slowly landed on the highest golden stone platform under the attention of countless watching eyes. Two figures faced each other on the golden stone platform. It was akin to the confrontation between a tiger and a lion in the forest. Even the sky above seemed to have been affected, turning dark and stormy. The innumerable gazes in the area converged onto this very location. Without a doubt, the battle here would decide the champion of the peak selection ceremony. On the spiritual energy tree, even the 7 hegemons and numerous higher echelons of the Spirit Devouring Mountain cast their gazes downwards, stopping on the two young figures.